Hey friends, drop a quick comment. What time are you watching this from? Morning coffee in California, evening unwind in Texas, or late night in Florida? In which state are you tuning in from? CA, TX, FL, GA, NY, NPA, SC. Love hearing from you. Before we dive into today's powerful story, I want to connect with you all. Where are you watching from? Is it sunny morning in California, midday in Texas, or maybe late night on the East Coast? I'm always amazed how these stories bring us together across different time zones and states. Drop your location in the comments. I read every single one. If you believe in accountability and fairness in how people are treated, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. What happens in the next few minutes will change lives forever, expose a broken culture, and remind us all that sometimes justice arrives wearing an unexpected face. That bag is too big for the cabin. People like you always think rules don't apply. The words sliced through the humid air of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport's Terminal D, like a blade, sharp and intentional. Zoe Mitchell felt them hit her body before her mind fully registered their meaning. Her heartbeat instantly accelerated. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold wave of adrenaline washed over her skin. "We need to move forward with boarding now," came another voice from nearby, completely oblivious to the confrontation brewing at gate D14. The words weren't whispered. They were projected, meant to be heard by everyone in line, meant to embarrass, meant to establish dominance in this small kingdom of vinyl seats and boarding passes. The voice belonged to Karen Winters, senior flight attendant for Blue Sky Airways, whose tight-lipped smile never reached her pale blue eyes as she stared down at 19-year-old Zoe. Just moments earlier, Karen had waved through a young blonde woman carrying two bags nearly identical in size to Zoe's with a warm, "Have a wonderful flight, sweetheart." The contrast wasn't subtle, it was deliberate. A performance of power played out daily at gates across the country. Terminal D buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of summer travel season. The scent of overpriced coffee mingled with the chemical-clean smell of industrial floor cleaner and the faint, sweet aroma of cinnamon rolls from the bakery 20 gates down. Fluorescent lights cast their unforgiving glow on tired faces, highlighting every line of exhaustion. The constant stream of announcements, final boarding calls, gate changes, requests for passengers, created a sonic wallpaper punctuated by squeaking wheeled luggage and children's occasional cries. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, heat waves rippled off the tarmac, distorting the view of massive aircraft being loaded with luggage and fuel. Zoe Mitchell stood at the front of the boarding line, her Stanford University hoodie zipped up against the aggressive air conditioning that raised goosebumps on her arms. At 19, she was navigating the tail end of grueling sophomore finals and the bone-deep exhaustion that came with them. All she wanted was to board Blue Sky Airways Flight 724, sink into her premium economy seat, and sleep until the wheels touched down in Atlanta. This summer break couldn't come soon enough. She was unassuming in her appearance, a stark contrast to the polished business travelers and Instagram-ready influencers surrounding her. Faded jeans, worn sneakers, and expensive noise-canceling headphones draped around her neck were her travel uniform. In one hand, she clutched her phone displaying her boarding pass. On her shoulder hung her navy blue backpack, and in her other hand, she held a simple burgundy tote bag that contained her laptop, textbook, and a small pill case with her anxiety medication. Zoe was no stranger to air travel. Her father had instilled in her a methodical approach to navigating airports since she was old enough to carry her own bag. She knew the rules, not just the ones posted on signs, but the unspoken ones. 2. Keep moving. Don't hold up lines. Be prepared. Respect space. She'd flown this route between Stanford and home at least 12 times in the past year alone. The line for Group 3 boarding began to move. Zoe shuffled forward, her gaze fixed on the jet bridge, the gateway to 5 hours of blessed quiet and the warmth of home. The passengers ahead of her passed through without incident, a businessman with a rolling suitcase and laptop bag, an older white couple with matching neck pillows and carry-ons, a young white woman with two bags similar to Zoe's own setup. And then she was at the front, boarding pass ready on her phone, burgundy tote securely gripped, navy backpack balanced on her shoulder. Through the windows, she could see the Blue Sky Airways Airbus A320 waiting, its blue and silver livery gleaming in the afternoon sun. Home was just 5 hours and one boarding process away. The digital display above the gate changed Flight 724 to San Francisco, now boarding Group 3. The timestamp read 3:42 p.m. Final boarding would be at 4:05 p.m. Zoe had timed her arrival perfectly. As always. "Boarding pass?" a sharp voice commanded. Zoe looked up, offering a polite, tired smile to the flight attendant scanning tickets. The woman's name tag read Karen Winters, senior cabin crew. Little did Zoe know that this routine interaction was about to become anything but routine. Boarding line contrast, 3:42 p.m., 23 minutes before final boarding. Karen Winters looked to be in her late 40s, with a blonde bob cut so precise it seemed to form a helmet around her face, held rigid with hairspray. She wore the blue sky uniform, navy blue with silver accents. With additional flourishes, not part of the standard issue, a decorative scarf nodded just so. 3 silver bracelets that clinked as she moved her wrist, and a pin collection that suggested years of service but had begun to weigh down her lapel like small medals of honor. Her eyes, a pale, judgmental blue, didn't scan Zoe, they inspected her, lingering with obvious disapproval on her hoodie, her jeans, her simple appearance. Those eyes narrowed slightly as they moved from Zoe's face to her bags, a micro-expression of decision forming, before she'd even checked the boarding pass. There was something in that gaze that suggested Zoe had already committed an offense simply by standing there. Karen had been with Blue Sky for 24 years. She'd started back when the airline was still called Atlantic Coast Airways, before the merger, before the rebranding. She'd served drinks to senators, once to a minor celebrity, and had developed what she considered an infallible instinct for trouble. In her 2 decades of service, she'd seen the industry change, her authority diminish, and younger flight attendants with less experience and less dedication promoted above her. 3 months earlier, Karen had been passed over for the senior cabin manager position she'd coveted. The role had gone to Trevor Harrison, 15 years her junior, with half her experience. The official reason was his fresh perspective and innovative approach to customer care. The unofficial reason, which she suspected but couldn't prove, was that the airline wanted younger faces in leadership roles. That rejection had festered inside her, transforming her once professional demeanor into something harder, more brittle, ready to crack at the slightest pressure. She'd begun to see every interaction as a test of her remaining authority, a chance to prove her indispensability through rigid enforcement of rules, both real and imagined. Just 5 minutes earlier, Karen had processed a stream of passengers with varying degrees of warmth, all calibrated to her instant assessment of their status and worth. "Good afternoon, Mr. Landry," she'd said to a silver-haired executive in a tailored suit, despite having never met him before. His first-class boarding pass and monogrammed luggage had earned him her most deferential tone. Her hand had lightly touched his arm as she gestured toward the jet bridge. "Oh, honey, let me help you with that." She'd offered to a young blonde woman in designer jeans, actually rearranging items in an oversized tote that clearly exceeded size limitations. "If you just tuck this part in like this, there you go, sweetheart. Perfect, have a wonderful flight." Those should be fine. She'd nodded to an older white couple whose identical roller bags were standard carry-on size, but noticeably larger than Zoe's backpack. She'd given them a conspiratorial wink. "Y'all enjoy your trip now." But now, and as Zoe stood before her, Karen's demeanor transformed. The professional smile remained, but it thinned and hardened, not reaching her eyes. Her posture straightened, hands clasping in front of her in a gesture that projected authority rather than service. The space between them seemed to grow colder despite the terminal's warmth. Zoe held out her phone. "Good afternoon," she said, voice clear but soft with exhaustion. Karen scanned the phone with a quick, efficient motion. Beep. The scanner confirmed the valid boarding pass. "Mitchell, Zoe, Premium Economy, Seat 12A." But her eyes weren't on the confirmation screen. They had dropped to Zoe's burgundy tote and navy backpack. "You have too many items," Karen said, her voice flat and loud enough for the people behind Zoe to hear. "You're only allowed 1 personal item and 1 carry-on." Zoe blinked, momentarily confused. She gestured to her backpack and tote. "This is my carry-on, and this is my personal item," she explained calmly. "The tote fits under the seat. I've flown with the same setup dozens of times. Karen's smile was a thin, unpleasant line. I'm sure you have. But today, on my flight, that tote is too large to be a personal item. You're holding up the line. Miss, step aside and we'll have the gate agent check it for you. The businessman directly behind Zoe glanced at his watch, then at her bags, his expression neutral but attentive. Two college-age girls further back in line exchanged glances, one whispering something to the other. An older woman with carefully coiffed silver hair pursed her lips in disapproval, though whether at Zoe or at Karen wasn't immediately clear. But it's not too large, Zoe insisted, trying to keep her voice even. The frustration of exams and fatigue was making her patience thin. Look, Desa, it has my laptop and medication in it. It's a standard laptop bag. It fits perfectly in the sizer. Behind her, the line was growing. A family with young children shifted impatiently. A businessman checked his watch. Two flight attendants walking past slowed to observe the situation, exchanging knowing glances as they recognized Karen at the center of yet another incident. Ma'am, please step aside so we can continue boarding, Karen said, her voice growing firmer, louder. Your bag needs to be checked. A young white woman in a floral dress stepped up to the counter at the adjacent line. Karen's colleague, a younger flight attendant named Brittany, processed her boarding pass with a smile. The woman carried a backpack and a tote bag visibly larger than Zoe's, yet Brittany waved her through without comment. The contrast wasn't lost on those watching. Several passengers glanced between the two boarding lanes, the disparate treatment now impossible to ignore. A middle-aged man in a business suit frowned slightly, his eyes moving from Zoe's bag to similar bags carried by other passengers who had already boarded without issue. As the line behind her grew, Zoe felt the weight of every impatient stare like physical pressure on her back. The air conditioning suddenly felt too cold against her skin, raising goosebumps on her arms. Her mouth went dry. What should have been a routine boarding had become a public spectacle, with her cast in the role of problem passenger, troublemaker, outsider. It was a familiar feeling, one she'd experienced too many times before, at stores where security followed her but not her white friends, at restaurants where hosts seated her family near kitchens despite empty tables by windows, at school events where parents assumed she was from somewhere else despite her Atlanta roots going back generations. In her head, she could hear her father's voice. Stay calm, know the rules better than they do, document everything. But right now, with exhaustion clouding her thoughts and her medication packed away in the bag being challenged, staying calm was becoming increasingly difficult. Direct confrontation, 3:47 p.m., 18 minutes before final boarding. To prove her point, Zoe turned to the metal baggage sizer next to the counter and dropped her burgundy tote bag into the personal item slot. It slid in with inches to spare on all sides. The metal frame didn't even touch the fabric. She looked back at Karen, expecting a resigned wave on. Instead, Karen's face hardened. The blue eyes turned to ice. She saw Zoe's demonstration not as proof, but as defiance, a public challenge to her authority that could not go unanswered. Ma'am, I am the senior crew member on this flight, Karen said, her voice dropping into a low, threatening monotone. The sizers are a guide. I make the final determination, and I determine that bag is not compliant. Now, are you going to step aside and check the bag, or are you refusing a flight crew instruction? The shift in language was immediate and terrifying. Refusing instruction was a trigger phrase, one that moved a passenger from annoying to security risk in the airline industry's specialized vocabulary. It was a phrase that could escalate a disagreement about bag size into removal from a flight. Or worse, several passengers who understood the implications of that terminology tensed visibly. A middle-aged Hispanic woman in line behind Zoe winced, recognizing the deliberate escalation. Sweat beaded at Zoe's hairline despite the cold air. I'm not refusing anything, Zoe said, struggling to keep her voice level as her heart pounded. I'm just showing you that my bag meets the airline's published requirements. She gestured to the sizer where her bag sat, clearly within the outlined dimensions. Karen stepped out from behind the counter, moving into Zoe's personal space. The silver bracelets on her wrist jingled as she pointed directly at the tote bag. Remove that from the sizer immediately. You're causing a disruption to the boarding process. The heat of embarrassment crept up Zoe's neck, prickling her skin and making her ears burn. She was acutely aware of the eyes on her, Dozens of strangers witnessing her humiliation, judging her, perhaps some even enjoying the show. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her bag, the tremor visible to anyone looking closely. Have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone abusing their authority, knowing that fighting back would only make things worse? That terrible sensation of powerlessness, of injustice witnessed but unchallenged by those around you, the taste of words you want to say but can't, bitter on your tongue. Before we dive deeper into what happens next in this true story of power, prejudice, and justice. Tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in accountability and fairness in how people are treated, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. What happens in the next few minutes will change lives forever, expose a broken culture, and remind us all that sometimes justice arrives wearing an unexpected face. Step aside now, Karen commanded, gesturing to a space away from the boarding line. Her voice carried just enough for nearby passengers to hear, creating a small audience for Zoe's humiliation. My medication is in this bag, Zoe explained, trying one last rational appeal. Her voice caught slightly on the word medication, betraying her growing distress. I need to keep it with me. It's why I always pack it here, following FAA guidelines for necessary medical items. Karen's eyebrows rose in performative disbelief. Medication, let me see it. She held out her hand expectantly, palm up, fingers wiggling in a give it here gesture. The request was inappropriate, invasive, and possibly illegal, but Karen delivered it with such authority that several onlookers nodded in agreement, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. An older man muttered, "Just show her and get on with it," his impatience directed at Zoe rather than at the person causing the delay. Zoe clutched her bag closer, feeling the familiar rectangle of her pill case through the fabric. I'm not required to show you my private medical information. The airline's own policy states that medication should be kept in carry-on luggage, and this is my carry-on. If you can't prove there's actual medication in there, then I have to assume you are being untruthful, Karen replied, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Her voice took on a theatrical quality, as if she were performing for the growing audience. That's a serious security concern. Now the situation was escalating beyond a mere baggage dispute. Karen was deliberately framing Zoe as not just difficult, but potentially dangerous. A passenger lying to crew members, refusing instructions, disrupting boarding procedures. The choreography was familiar to anyone who had witnessed similar incidents, first the technical violation, real or imagined, then the escalation to security concerns, then the inevitable removal. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, the injustice becoming too obvious to ignore. A black woman in her 40s shook her head slightly. Recognizing the pattern, an Asian man in a business suit frowned, glancing between his own carry-on and Zoe's clearly smaller bag. Others watched with the detached interest of people observing someone else's misfortune, grateful it wasn't happening to them. Some had already taken out their phones, sensing that what was unfolding might be worth documenting. I've flown over 50,000 miles with Blue Sky this year alone, Zoe said, her voice starting to waver despite her best efforts. The words came out in a rush, driven by a desperate need to be heard, to be believed. I know the baggage policy. I follow it every time. My bag fits in the sizer. It meets all published requirements. Karen's eyes narrowed at this challenge to her authority. Her nostrils flared slightly, her breathing becoming more pronounced. Are you telling me how to do my job? Miss, because I've been with this airline for 24 years, and I don't need passengers explaining policies to me. The confrontation had moved beyond the original issue. It was now about power, about making an example of the young black woman who dared to stand up for herself, who dared to know the rules, who dared to expect fair treatment. All I want is to board my flight with the same bags I've always carried, Zoe said, fighting to keep her composure. The fatigue of finals week, the stress of travel, and now this public humiliation were a perfect storm threatening to overwhelm her. She could feel tears threatening to form and blinked rapidly to suppress them, determined not to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Karen gestured toward the gate desk. You can check your bag at the desk, or you can take a different flight. Those are your options right now. A murmur ran through the crowd. The flight wasn't full. There was plenty of overhead bin space. Everyone could see that Zoe's bag was well within size limits. This wasn't about airline policy or flight safety. It was about one woman's need to exert control, to win, to put someone in their place. "Is there a manager I can speak with?" Zoe asked, her voice quiet but firm. That question, the dreaded appeal to higher authority, caused something in Karen's expression to shift. A flash of anger, quickly masked by professional detachment. "I am the senior crew member on this flight. If you'd like to file a complaint, you can do so after you comply with my instructions or forfeit your seat." The digital display above the gate updated Flight 724 to San Francisco, boarding Group 4. Time was running out. Documentation begins. The confrontation had not gone unnoticed. Several passengers, sensing the injustice unfolding before them, had begun to document the scene. Emily Rodriguez, a 32-year-old Hispanic marketing executive waiting to board in Group 4, had been watching the interaction with growing concern. When Karen demanded to see Zoe's medication, Emily quietly slipped her iPhone from her Prada purse and began recording. Her instincts as both a marketing professional and a woman of color who had faced similar treatment told her that this moment needed to be preserved. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to the woman next to her. "That bag clearly fits in the sizer. I've got a bigger one they didn't even look at." The woman, a middle-aged white teacher from Ohio, nodded agreement. "I hate seeing this stuff happen. It's so obvious what's going on." 3 rows back, Jackson Taylor, a popular travel influencer with over 45,000 followers, had also picked up on the situation. Unlike Emily, he wasn't subtle about his documentation. He held his phone up openly, narrating in a hushed voice. "I'm here at Hartsfield Jackson, and y'all are watching in real time as a Blue Sky flight attendant is giving this girl a hard time about a bag that clearly meets size requirements," he said, his southern accent becoming more pronounced as his indignation grew. "I just watched 3 white passengers board with larger bags. No problem. This is why I tell my followers to always record these interactions." Jackson's live stream instantly connected with his audience. The notification on TikTok had grabbed attention from followers who recognized the location, and comments began flooding in from viewers outraged by what they were seeing. "This is discrimination happening live. We all know why she's targeting her. That flight attendant is on a power trip. I'm screen recording this entire thing. Blue Sky Airways, you better handle this." Across the gate area, phones were emerging from pockets and purses, each capturing a different angle of the confrontation. In an age where injustice could be broadcast globally in seconds, Karen's behavior had just become a potential viral moment, though she remained oblivious, focused entirely on asserting her authority over Zoe. A retired teacher in her 70s leaned toward her husband, her voice tight with disgust. "That poor girl. I've seen this kind of thing too many times. The more things change." Her husband nodded gravely, his hand resting protectively on hers. "Someone should step in." But like so many bystanders throughout history, they remained just that, observers, not participants. The social pressure to avoid conflict, to not get involved in someone else's problem, kept them and others rooted in place, documenting but not intervening. Karen became vaguely aware of the phones pointing in her direction. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but rather than moderating her behavior, it seemed to intensify her resolve. If she was being watched, she would demonstrate her authority by all the more firmly. "You need to step aside now," Karen repeated, gesturing more forcefully, her silver bracelets jingling with the movement. "You're delaying the entire boarding process." In reality, Karen herself was causing the delay, but she had skillfully shifted the blame to Zoe, casting her as the problem that needed to be removed for things to proceed smoothly. It was a tactic as old as power itself. Create the crisis, then position yourself as the solution. Zoe glanced around, suddenly conscious of all the recording devices. Part of her felt a surge of hope. Here was evidence, documentation that could vindicate her later. But another part felt the acute embarrassment of having her humiliation preserved forever in digital form, to be viewed and judged by strangers on the internet. From the back of the boarding line, a man in a business suit called out, his deep voice carrying easily over the ambient noise. "Just let her board. Her bag is fine. We're all going to miss connections at this rate." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but Karen was unmoved. She turned toward the voice, her expression hardening. Sir, I'm handling a security situation here. Please be patient. The word security sent a chill through the gathering. It was another deliberate escalation, transforming a dispute about a handbag into something that suggested danger, threat, the need for intervention by authorities. The strategic use of that term in a post-9/11 travel environment was not accidental. Jackson's live stream viewer count jumped from 230 to over 700 in less than a minute as his followers shared the link across platforms. The comments were coming so fast now that they blurred together. This is how it always starts. Someone get her name and badge number. Blue Sky, are you seeing this? Where is a manager? That girl is handling this with amazing composure. Emily Rodriguez's fingers flew across her phone screen as she simultaneously recorded and sent a direct message to Blue Sky's customer service Twitter account. Witnessing disturbing discrimination at Gate D14 in Atlanta right now by flight attendant Karen Winters. Sending video evidence? This is outrageous. Nearby, a Blue Sky pilot walking past the gate slowed, observing the situation with a furrowed brow. For a moment, it seemed he might approach, might use his authority to defuse the situation. Then he checked his watch and continued walking, late for his own flight assignment, unwilling to get involved in what was clearly becoming a messy confrontation. Zoe stood her ground, her father's advice echoing in her mind. Stay calm, know the rules better than they do, document everything. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate despite the tremor in her hands. I'm going to record this interaction for my own protection, she said clearly, meeting Karen's gaze directly for the first time. Her voice was steadier than she felt. Karen's expression darkened, a flash of genuine alarm crossing her face. You do not have permission to record me. Georgia is a one-party consent state, Zoe replied steadily, the law classes she'd taken as part of her pre-law curriculum coming to her aid. I don't need your permission to record an interaction I'm part of in a public place. For the briefest moment, uncertainty flickered across Karen's face. She hadn't expected this young woman to know the law, to speak with such composure despite the pressure being applied. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by hardened resolve. This is private property, Karen countered, gesturing to the gate area. And as a representative of Blue Sky Airways, I am informing you that recording is not permitted during the boarding process. This was another fabrication. There was no such policy, but Karen delivered it with such conviction that several onlookers lowered their phones. Uncertain. The confident assertion of false authority was a powerful tool when wielded by someone in a uniform. Zoe, however, kept her phone raised, the camera clearly focused on Karen. Blue Sky's own website states that passengers may record interactions with staff provided they don't interfere with safety procedures. I'm simply creating a record of this interaction. The standoff continued, with neither woman willing to back down. Around them, the digital ecosystem was already spreading their conflict far beyond Gate D14. Jackson's live stream had climbed to over 1,200 viewers. Emily's video was being shared in real time with Blue Sky's corporate offices. Other passengers were texting clips to friends and family, posting to Instagram stories, sharing in private messaging groups. In the world of smartphones and social media, no injustice remained truly local anymore. What happened at Gate D14 was already rippling outward, crossing state lines, reaching corporate headquarters, capturing the attention of strangers who would never set foot in Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, but who recognized the pattern playing out before their eyes. Security escalation, 3:52 p.m., 13 minutes before final boarding. You're being disruptive, Karen said, her voice taking on an edge of finality. I need you to step aside right now, or I'll be forced to call security. The threat hung in the air, heavy with implication. In the post-9/11 era of air travel, security wasn't just a word. It was a system that could deny boarding, issue fines, even arrest passengers deemed problematic. It was the nuclear option of airport interactions, and Karen had just put her hand on the button. Zoe felt her heart rate accelerate. Her mouth went completely dry. The situation was spiraling beyond a simple baggage dispute into territory with potentially serious consequences. Still, she stood her ground. My bag meets all size requirements, she repeated, her voice remarkably steady despite her internal turmoil. I've shown you that it fits in the sizer. I've explained that it contains medication I need to keep with me. There is no legitimate reason to prevent me from boarding with this bag. Karen reached for the radio clipped to her belt. Her hand was steady, her movements deliberate, as if she'd choreographed this escalation many times before. This passenger is refusing crew member instructions and becoming belligerent, she said into the device, her eyes never leaving Zoe's face. I need security assistance at gate D14 immediately. The word belligerent sent a ripple through the crowd. Umming and Zoe's behavior could remotely be described that way. She had been calm, rational, and respectful throughout the entire interaction. Karen was creating a narrative that bore no relationship to reality, but it was a narrative that played into deeply ingrained stereotypes and assumptions about young Black women: angry, aggressive, difficult. Jackson's live stream comments exploded. She's lying. The girl is totally calm. This is how Black people get killed. Someone needs to step in now. I'm contacting Blue Sky Corporate as we speak. I fly this airline every week, and I'm done after seeing this. Within minutes, a uniformed airport security officer arrived at the gate. Officer Mike Bennett, 35, white, with a military-style haircut and the confident stride of someone used to being obeyed, approached the scene. His hand rested casually on his belt near his radio, his eyes scanning the situation with practiced efficiency. What seems to be the problem here, he asked, addressing Karen rather than Zoe, immediately establishing whose account he considered authoritative. Karen straightened, her demeanor shifting from confrontational to professional victim. This passenger is refusing to comply with baggage policies and has become confrontational when asked to check her oversized item. She's delaying the entire boarding process and creating a disturbance. Bennett turned to assess Zoe, his gaze taking in her Stanford hoodie, her jeans, her carefully controlled expression. There was something in his eyes, a momentary flicker of doubt, perhaps, that suggested he recognized the disparity between Karen's description and the calm young woman standing before him. Ma'am, you need to comply with flight crew instructions. That's federal regulation, he said, his tone firm but not hostile. Her instructions contradict the airline's own published policies. Zoe responded, maintaining her composure despite the escalating situation. My bag fits in the sizer, which is the standard measurement tool. I've shown her that. I've also explained that it contains necessary medication. Bennett glanced at the bag, then at the sizer where it had previously fit with room to spare. That flicker of uncertainty crossed his face again. His right hand, which had been resting on his belt, dropped to his side. At that moment, gate manager Lisa Gonzalez arrived, drawn by the commotion and the security presence. At 41, I reached, the Hispanic woman had worked for Blue Sky for 15 years and had handled countless passenger disputes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform impeccable, her expression professionally neutral despite the tension in the air. What's happening here? She asked, taking in the scene Karen's defensive posture, Officer Bennett's uncertain expression, Zoe's contained distress, and the dozens of passengers watching, many with phones raised. Karen immediately launched into her version of events. This passenger is refusing to check an oversized bag and has been argumentative and disruptive throughout the boarding process. She's delaying the entire flight. Lisa turned to Zoe. May I see your bag? Please. Unlike Karen's demand, Lisa's request was professional and neutral. There was no hostility in her tone, no presumption of wrongdoing. Zoe handed over the burgundy tote, the relief of dealing with someone reasonable evident in her face. Lisa examined it, turning it in her hands to assess its dimensions. Then she walked to the sizer and placed it inside. As everyone had seen earlier, it fit with room to spare on all sides. This bag meets our size requirements, Lisa stated simply, her tone factual rather than judgmental. Karen's face flushed pink, a blotchy color spreading up her neck to her cheeks. The passenger has 2 bags. That's her personal item, but she also has a backpack. She's trying to bring too many items on board. I'm allowed 1 carry-on and 1 personal item, Zoe explained to Lisa. My backpack is my carry-on, and this tote is my personal item. That's what your website states, and that's how I've flown on every Blue Sky flight before today. Lisa nodded. That's correct. Our policy allows 1 carry-on and 1 personal item, provided they meet size requirements, which both of your bags do. Her professional assessment was delivered calmly but with the clear authority of someone who knew the policies intimately. The assessment should have ended the matter there, but Karen was too committed to her position to back down. As senior cabin crew, I have final authority over boarding decisions, Karen insisted, her voice taking on a brittle quality. And I've determined that her bags are not acceptable for this flight. The power struggle was now out in the open. This wasn't about bags anymore. It was about Karen's need to win, to assert her authority, to not lose face in front of dozens of witnesses. The actual airline policies had become secondary to her determination to prevail. Officer Bennett shifted uncomfortably, caught between a security call that seemed increasingly unwarranted and the awkward position of potentially undermining a flight crew member's authority. His eyes moved between the two airline employees, clearly hoping Lisa would resolve the situation without requiring his intervention. Zoe's phone vibrated with a notification. The Blue Sky app flashed urgently on her screen. Flight 724. Final boarding call. Time was running out. If this wasn't resolved quickly, she would miss her flight regardless of who was right. 5 hours of uncomfortable sleep in an airport chair loomed as a possibility, along with the hassle of rebooking and the additional night away from home during an exhausting finals week. The crowd around them had grown. Passengers from other gates had drifted over, attracted by the confrontation and the increasing security presence. What had begun as a simple boarding dispute was becoming a public spectacle, with Zoe cast as either victim or villain depending on the observer's perspective and biases. Jackson's live stream had now climbed to over 3,000 viewers, with comments flooding in faster than anyone could possibly read them. Screenshots of the stream were being shared on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, expanding the audience exponentially. Hashtag Blue Sky Shame was already beginning to trend in Atlanta. Lisa tried again to defuse this situation. Ms. Winters, both bags meet our size requirements. I don't see any reason to prevent boarding. Karen's expression hardened, her jaw setting stubbornly. You weren't here for the entire interaction. This passenger has been argumentative and uncooperative from the start. As the senior crew member responsible for cabin safety, I am not comfortable having her on my flight with this attitude. And there it was, the real issue laid bare. Not the bags, not the policies, but Karen's perception of Zoe's attitude. That nebulous, subjective assessment that had been used throughout history to police and control behavior, particularly from young people of color who dared to stand up for themselves. I have not been argumentative, Zoe stated clearly, addressing Lisa rather than Karen. I've simply defended my right to board with baggage that meets all stated requirements. I've been calm and respectful throughout this entire interaction, despite being treated unfairly. Around them, several passengers nodded in agreement. A woman in her 60s spoke up. The young lady has been completely reasonable. I've been watching the whole time. A businessman added, This is ridiculous. Her bags are smaller than mine, and no one said a word to me. The tide of public opinion was turning visibly, and Karen sensed it. Her authority was slipping away, challenged not just by Zoe, but now by other passengers and even her own colleague. As the crew member in charge of this flight, I have final say on who boards, Karen insisted, doubling down. And I am not comfortable with this passenger's behavior. Officer Bennett, recognizing the situation was deteriorating rather than resolving, raised his radio to call for a supervisor. This had moved beyond a simple baggage dispute, and he wanted additional authority present before taking any action. Phone call interruption, 3:56 p.m. 9 minutes before door closure, amid the escalating tension, Zoe's phone began to ring. The screen displayed a simple dad with a photo of Marcus Mitchell in a business suit, smiling warmly at the camera. Karen immediately seized on the distraction. Put that away. You can't be on your phone during a security situation. Officer Bennett, more reasonably, said, Ma'am, it might be best to handle this situation before taking calls. Zoe hesitated, torn between the immediate crisis and the call from her father. Under normal circumstances, she would never ignore his call. It was one of their family rules, established years ago when her mother's health crisis had taught them the importance of always being reachable to one another. I need to take this, she said, her thumb hovering over the answer button. It might be important. Criminals don't get phone privileges, Karen snapped, the mask of professionalism slipping completely to reveal the ugly bias beneath. The word criminals hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several passengers gasped audibly. Officer Bennett's eyebrows shot up in surprise at the inappropriate escalation. Lisa Gonzalez's professional demeanor cracked momentarily as she stared at Karen in disbelief. Jackson's live stream caught the moment perfectly. His hushed voice narrating, "Did you all hear that? She just called this college student a criminal for trying to answer her phone. This is completely out of hand." The comments section exploded. "Criminal for what crime exactly? This is racist as hell. I'm saving this whole video and sending it to CNN. Blue Sky Airways, your employee just called a passenger a criminal on a live stream with thousands of witnesses. She needs to be fired immediately." Zoe felt as if she'd been physically struck. The casual dehumanization, the immediate criminalization of her existence, was a blow all too familiar yet still shocking in its brazen delivery. She'd been called many things before. Her academic excellence often dismissed as affirmative action. Her articulate speech described as so well spoken, but criminal was a new level of dehumanization. Her phone continued to ring. As it went to voicemail, a text message appeared on the screen. "Dad, I'm at the airport. Where are you? Flight shows boarding." The realization that her father was somewhere in the airport should have been comforting, but it only heightened Zoe's anxiety. What if he came looking for her and got caught up in this escalating situation? What if he reacted as any father might when seeing his daughter treated this way? "That's my father," Zoe explained, trying to keep her voice level despite the emotional turmoil. "He's asking where I am." Karen's dismissive snort made it clear she either didn't believe this or didn't care. "We're not concerned with who's calling you. We're concerned with your compliance with crew member instructions and security protocols." Lisa Gonzalez, recognizing the situation was spiraling beyond recovery, attempted to take control. "Let's all take a step back. Ms. Mitchell, your bags do meet our size requirements. Officer Bennett, there doesn't appear to be any security issue here. Ms. Winters, I believe we can allow boarding to continue." But Karen had invested too much of her authority in this confrontation to back down now. "I am the senior crew member assigned to this flight. FAA regulations give me final authority over who boards my aircraft, and I am stating, officially, that I am uncomfortable having this passenger on today's flight due to her disruptive behavior and non-compliance with crew instructions." It was the nuclear option, invoking federal regulations to deny boarding. Once those words were spoken, the machinery of airport security protocol would be difficult to stop or reverse. Another text from Marcus appeared on Zoe's phone. "Dad, just landed. Coming to your gate now. Flight 724. Right." The clock on the boarding screen now read 3:58 p.m. The final boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. "Final boarding call for Blue Sky Airways Flight 724 to San Francisco. All passengers should be at gate D14 for immediate boarding." Officer Bennett, increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, spoke into his radio. "Supervisor request at gate D4. Passenger boarding dispute requiring management intervention." Karen turned to him, her voice low but urgent. "This isn't just a boarding dispute. This passenger has been argumentative, has refused to comply with crew instructions, and is displaying behavioral indicators that concern me from a safety perspective. I am not comfortable having her on my flight." The deliberately vague behavioral indicators and safety concerns were the magic words in post-9/11 air travel, phrases that triggered specific security protocols and almost always resulted in passengers being removed from flights, regardless of the legitimacy of the concerns. Zoe's phone buzzed with another text. "Dad, I see a crowd at your gate. Is everything okay?" The final call for boarding had been announced. Passengers were looking anxiously at their watches and phones, concerned about departure times and connections. The crowd around gate D14 had swelled as curiosity seekers and sympathetic observers gathered to witness the confrontation. Karen delivered her ultimatum. "You have two choices. You can voluntarily deplane from this flight and discuss rebooking options with the gate agent, or security can escort you from the gate area. Either way, you will not be flying on this aircraft today." It was, in essence, a no-choice choice, the illusion of agency designed to make the inevitable removal seem somewhat voluntary. It was a tactic Zoe recognized from her studies of negotiation and power dynamics, but recognizing it didn't make it any less effective or any less humiliating. For a moment, it seemed as if all paths led to defeat, to Zoe being removed from a flight she had every right to board, separated from luggage she needed to keep with her, delayed in her journey home after an exhausting week of finals. All because one person had decided, arbitrarily and inequitably, to make an example of her. As Zoe weighed her limited options, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew everyone's attention. Something was happening. Something that would transform what had been a private humiliation into a public reckoning with consequences none of them could yet imagine. Father's approach, 4:01 p.m., 4 minutes before door closure. The crowd at gate D14 parted like the Red Sea as Marcus Mitchell moved through it, his presence commanding respect without a single word. Behind him trailed two airline executives in blue sky corporate attire, looking increasingly panicked as they realized what was unfolding. Marcus Mitchell stood 6'2", his athletic frame carried with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to moving through the world on his own terms. At 50, his close-cropped hair had started showing distinguished touches of gray at the temples, contrasting with his deep brown skin. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that suggested authority without ostentation, the subtle blue tie clip bearing the Blue Sky Airways logo, a detail most would miss, but industry insiders would immediately recognize. The first indication that something significant was happening came from the security officer's radio. A burst of static was followed by an urgent voice. "Bennett, what's your status at D14? We have a priority situation developing." Officer Bennett furrowed his brow, confused by the sudden elevation of what had seemed like a routine dispute. "Still working on the boarding issue. What's the priority?" The radio crackled again. "VIP approaching your location. Corporate level. Stand by for instructions." Throughout the terminal, a ripple of recognition spread among Blue Sky employees. Gate agents across other counters straightened their uniforms and tugged their blazers into place. A pilot heading toward another gate stopped mid-stride, did a double take, and changed direction to observe from a respectful distance. Lisa Gonzalez's eyes widened as she spotted Marcus approaching. She had seen him before, in corporate videos and at the annual leadership conference, but never in person, never at her gate, never looking so purposeful and, if she was reading his expression correctly, concerned. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her professional demeanor tinged with surprise. "I wasn't aware you were visiting Atlanta operations today." At the sound of that name, Mitchell, Karen's head snapped up, her gaze locking onto the approaching figure, for the first time since the confrontation began. Uncertainty flickered across her face. Mitchell, the same last name as the passenger she'd been refusing. Coincidence, or something else entirely? The blood drained from her face as realization dawned, leaving her complexion almost gray against the blue of her uniform. Zoe turned, relief washing over her face at the sight of her father, despite her efforts to handle the situation independently. There was something profoundly comforting about his presence, about not facing this injustice alone. As Marcus reached the gate desk, the two executives behind him hung back slightly, their expressions a mixture of deference and apprehension. One quickly accessed a tablet, fingers flying across the screen as if searching for information that might be urgently needed. "Zoe," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying easily across the now hushed gate area. "I got your text. Is everything all right?" Before Zoe could answer, Karen stepped forward, perhaps sensing that reasserting control might salvage the situation. "Sir, we're handling a boarding issue with this passenger. If you're on flight 724, I'll need to see your boarding pass." Marcus turned to face Karen fully, his expression neutral, but his eyes intensely focused. There was no anger in his demeanor, just a concentrated attention that seemed to see through surface appearances to the essence beneath. He studied her name badge for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Winters, I'd like to understand what's happening here." The formality and authority in his tone caused Karen to hesitate slightly. This wasn't the typical angry relative ready to make a scene. This man projected a calm confidence that suggested he was accustomed to being heard, to having his questions answered promptly and thoroughly. "This passenger has been attempting to board with oversized luggage," Karen began, her explanation already shifting from her earlier accusations. Gone were the claims of belligerence and criminal behavior, replaced with a technical violation that seemed increasingly tenuous. When asked to check her bag, she became argumentative and refused to comply with crew instructions. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her explanation. Then he turned to Zoe. "What's your understanding of the situation?" Zoe, composed despite the stress, explained clearly, My bags meet all size requirements. I demonstrated that by placing my tote in the sizer, where it fit with room to spare. Ms. Winters insisted it was too large despite the evidence and threatened to have me removed from the flight if I didn't check it. When I explained that it contains medication I need to keep with me, she demanded to see the medication, which I declined as an invasion of privacy. Marcus listened attentively, giving his daughter the same respect and attention he had given to Karen. Then he turned to Lisa Gonzalez. As the gate manager, what's your assessment? Lisa straightened, recognizing the need for complete professionalism. Both bags meet our published size requirements. Sir, I verified that personally when I arrived at the scene. And the other passengers boarding this flight, have their bags been subjected to the same scrutiny? Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Lisa hesitated, caught between professional loyalty and the clear truth. I can't speak to how every passenger was processed, sir. Marcus nodded again, then turned to address Karen directly. Ms. Winters, would you be willing to explain why this particular passenger's compliant bags presented an issue when others did not? The question hung in the air, precise and impossible to deflect. It cut straight to the heart of the matter, to the inequitable treatment that had sparked the entire confrontation. Before Karen could formulate a response, Jackson's voice called out from the crowd. Sir, I have a live stream of the entire incident, including multiple white passengers boarding with the larger bags without any issues. It's got over 3,000 people watching right now. Marcus glanced toward the voice, acknowledging the young man with a slight nod. Thank you. I believe that documentation will be valuable. The significance of that statement, that evidence was being considered valuable, sent a current of apprehension through Karen. The narrative she had constructed was crumbling under the weight of recorded evidence and professional scrutiny. Officer Bennett, sensing the shift in dynamics, took a half step back from the situation. His radio crackled again, this time with a message he clearly wasn't meant to hear. That's Marcus Mitchell, IEO of Blue Sky. Proceed with extreme caution. Bennett's eyes widened slightly as the pieces fell into place. The passenger being hassled was Zoe Mitchell. Marcus Mitchell was the CEO of Blue Sky Airways, and Zoe Mitchell was his daughter. The security officer looked as if he'd just realized he was standing on thin ice over a deep lake. The reveal. A subtle shift had occurred in the gate area. The power dynamic that had so firmly favored Karen minutes earlier had inverted completely. Now she stood alone, her authority diminished with each passing second as the truth of the situation and the identity of the man standing before her dawned on everyone present. Marcus Mitchell's expression remained measured, betraying neither anger nor triumph as he observed Karen's dawning recognition. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of both personal concern and professional authority. What seems to be the problem with my daughter's bag, he asked, emphasizing the relationship in a way that couldn't be misinterpreted. Karen's face, already pale, now turned ashen. Her hand instinctively reached for the counter behind her, steadying herself as the full implication of her actions crashed over her like a wave. Zoe Mitchell. Mitchell. The same last name that appeared on every company-wide memo, on the signature line of her employment contract, on the building directory at corporate headquarters. She had spent the last 15 minutes humiliating, threatening, and attempting to remove the CEO's daughter from a flight over a bag that clearly met all requirements. The silver bracelets on Karen's wrist jingled as her hands trembled visibly. There seems to have been a misunderstanding, she managed, her voice thin and unsteady. A misunderstanding, Marcus repeated, the words neutral, but the tone suggesting he was giving her space to elaborate. There was no overt anger in his demeanor, just a focused attention that made Karen's discomfort all the more apparent. We've been having issues with oversized bags, Karen continued, the excuse sounding hollow even to her own ears. Sweat beaded at her hairline despite the air conditioning. I was simply trying to enforce our policies consistently. From the crowd, multiple voices rose in protest. That's not true. She let everyone else through with bigger bags. She specifically targeted her. She called her a criminal. I have it all on video. Marcus raised a hand slightly, and remarkably, the crowd fell silent. It was the subtle gesture of someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms and corporate retreats, now deployed in a crowded airport gate with equal effectiveness. Ms. Gonzalez, he said, turning to the gate manager. Would you be kind enough, Faust, to check the passenger manifest for this flight? Lisa quickly accessed her terminal. Of course, Mr. Mitchell. I believe you'll find that I'm also booked on this flight. Marcus continued. I was planning to surprise my daughter after her finals week and accompany her home, seat 12B, adjacent to hers. Lisa nodded, confirming. Yes, sir. You're both confirmed on this flight. Marcus turned back to Karen, whose professional demeanor had crumbled entirely. Her eyes darted around the gate area, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. She licked her lips nervously, her mouth suddenly dry. Miss Winters, I'd like to understand something, Marcus said, his voice remaining calm but penetrating. You stated that you weren't comfortable having my daughter on this flight due to what you termed behavioral indicators. Could you clarify what specific behaviors caused you concern? It was a masterful question, open-ended, professional, impossible to answer truthfully without revealing the bias that had driven her actions. The entire gate area seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Karen's response. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. Sir, she questioned my authority regarding the bag sizing. The words came out in awkward fragments, each one making her position weaker. I see, Marcus said, his tone remaining neutral. So to be clear, your safety concern was that she demonstrated knowledge of company policies regarding baggage dimensions. Put so plainly, the absurdity of the situation was inescapable. Several passengers had begun recording this exchange as well, capturing the systematic dismantling of Karen's position with devastating precision. Someone whispered, "This is going to go viral." And they were right. The incident was already spreading across social media platforms, with hashtag #BlueSkyShame trending in 3 cities. The 2 corporate executives who had followed Marcus to the gate now stepped forward. One, a woman in her mid-40s, spoke quietly to Marcus. Sir, we've arranged for Ms. Winters to be removed from flight duty immediately. David Williams, VP of Operations, is on the line and requesting to speak with you. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, but kept his focus on the situation at hand. Thank you, but that can wait. Right now, we have a flight ready to depart and passengers who have been unnecessarily delayed. He turned to Lisa. Please complete the boarding process for flight 724 as quickly as possible. I apologize to all passengers for the delay. Then to Officer Bennett, thank you for your assistance. Officer, I believe the security concern has been resolved. Bennett, relieved to have a graceful exit from the uncomfortable situation, nodded and stepped back. Yes, sir. Glad it's resolved. As the crowd began to disperse and passengers moved toward the boarding gate, Marcus finally turned his full attention to his daughter. His professional mask softened into paternal concern. Are you okay? He asked quietly, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Zoe nodded, the composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal finally showing small cracks. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I'm fine, just ready to go home. Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Let's board, then. We can talk more on the flight. As they moved toward the jet bridge, Jackson approached cautiously. Mr. Mitchell, I've been live streaming this whole incident. Over 5,000 people have watched it happen in real time. I just wanted to say, thank you for handling it the way you did. Marcus considered the young man thoughtfully. Thank you for documenting it. That's often the first step toward accountability. Karen Winters remained at the gate counter, her future career collapsing around her as surely as if the ceiling tiles were falling. The executive who had accompanied Marcus was now speaking to her in low, urgent tones, words that clearly signaled the beginning of serious consequences. As Zoe and Marcus boarded the aircraft, passengers already seated recognized him instantly. Whispers spread through the cabin. That's the CEO. Did you see what happened at the gate? The flight attendant didn't know she was refusing to let the CEO's daughter board. The story was already taking shape, transforming from an isolated incident of discrimination into a narrative of accountability and consequences that would soon extend far beyond Flight 724. Immediate aftermath, 4:04 p.m., 1 minute before door closure. As Marcus and Zoe settled into their adjacent seats in premium economy, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with energy. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with forced cheerfulness, hyper-aware that their CEO was on board and that one of their colleagues had just created a PR crisis that was spreading across social media with every passing minute. Karen Winters was nowhere to be seen, having been promptly removed from flight duties. In her place, a younger flight attendant named Trevor performed the safety briefing with meticulous attention to detail, his eyes occasionally darting nervously toward row 12 where the Mitchell sat. Zoe placed her burgundy tote bag, the item that had sparked the entire confrontation, under the seat in front of her, where it fit perfectly, just as she had known it would. Her navy backpack went into the overhead bin, alongside countless other bags of similar or larger size that had boarded without question. "I didn't know you were flying out today," Zoe said quietly to her father as the plane began its pushback from the gate. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving her feeling suddenly drained. "I wanted to surprise you," Marcus replied, his voice warm with affection beneath the lingering tension. "After your text about how exhausting finals were, I thought you might appreciate some company on the flight home." He paused, then added with a small smile, "Though I admit this wasn't quite the surprise I had planned." Zoe managed a tired laugh. "Definitely not what I expected either." She leaned her head back against the seat, finally allowing herself to relax. "Thanks for showing up when you did." Marcus's expression turned thoughtful. "I'm glad I was here, but I keep thinking about how differently this would have played out if I hadn't been." The implication hung between them, the recognition that Zoe's experience had been resolved only because of her connection to power, a connection that most passengers facing similar discrimination would never have. Outside the window, ground crew members guided the aircraft away from the terminal. The plane was departing 23 minutes behind schedule, a delay that would be officially attributed to boarding issues in the system, but that passengers would discuss in much more specific terms. Back in the terminal, a flurry of activity had erupted in the wake of the incident. Lisa Gonzalez was on the phone with David Williams, VP of Operations, giving a detailed account of what had transpired. "Yes, sir. Multiple passengers recorded the entire interaction." "No, sir. There was absolutely no justification for denying boarding." "Yes, Mr. Mitchell handled it with remarkable restraint. Officer Bennett was filing an incident report that carefully emphasized his limited role and noted that no actual security threat had been identified. His handwriting was slightly shakier than usual as he documented a situation that could have easily damaged his own career had he acted more aggressively based on Karen's misrepresentations." The two corporate executives who had accompanied Marcus were now huddled with Human Resources Representative Ashley Morgan, a 34-year-old white woman who had been summoned to the terminal with urgent instructions to begin a formal investigation. "We need to collect statements from witnesses immediately," Ashley directed, her voice crisp with focused energy. "Contact information from anyone willing to share their recordings. We need to get ahead of this before it explodes further on social media." Her concern was well-founded, but already too late. Jackson Taylor's live stream had ended when he boarded his connecting flight, but not before it had been viewed by over 7,800 people. Clips were being extracted, shared, and reshared across multiple platforms. The hashtag Blue Sky Shame was trending in 3 major cities. Emily Rodriguez, still in the terminal awaiting her own flight, had uploaded her recording to Twitter with the caption, "Watched a Blue Sky Airways flight attendant discriminate against a black passenger today." When her father showed up, turns out he was the CEO of the airline Justice served hashtag Blue Sky Shame, hashtag Travel While Black. Her post had already been retweeted over 1,200 times and picked up by several travel industry accounts with substantial followings. The comments ranged from vindicated satisfaction at seeing immediate consequences to deeper questions about how many similar incidents occurred daily without such high-profile intervention. On the aircraft, as it taxied toward the runway, Zoe finally allowed herself to process what had happened. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was ebbing, leaving behind a familiar emotional cocktail of anger, humiliation, and exhaustion. "It happens so often," she said quietly to her father, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "Usually not this dramatically, but it's always something. The extra scrutiny, the assumptions, having to be twice as prepared, twice as polite, twice as everything." Marcus nodded, the weariness in his expression suggesting he understood all too well. As a black executive who had risen to the highest levels of corporate America, He had navigated similar waters throughout his career, though rarely with the raw hostility Zoe had just experienced. "I know," he said simply, reaching over to squeeze her hand gently. "And I'm proud of how you handled it. You stayed composed. You knew your rights. You documented everything, exactly as we've talked about." A flight attendant approached their row, her smile professional, but her eyes nervous. Mitchell, Ms. Mitchell, can I get you anything before takeoff?" Wasser a pillow. The special attention, so different from the treatment Zoe had received at the gate, highlighted the absurdity of the situation. It shouldn't take being the CEO's daughter to be treated with basic respect and dignity. "We're fine, thank you," Marcus replied kindly. Recognizing that this flight attendant had nothing to do with what had occurred at the gate, as the plane accelerated down the runway, lifting into the Georgia sky, a different kind of elevation was occurring on the ground. What had begun as a routine case of discrimination, the kind that happens daily in airports, stores, and public spaces across the country, was transforming into something else entirely, a high-profile incident with a CEO's direct involvement, captured on video, spreading across social media, impossible to ignore or dismiss. For Karen Winters, it had been the perfect storm, choosing to make an example of exactly the wrong passenger on exactly the wrong day, with dozens of witnesses and multiple recordings ensuring that every word, every action, every microaggression was preserved for review for Blue Sky Airways. It was rapidly becoming a defining moment, a public test of whether their stated values of inclusivity and respect would translate into concrete action when one of their own had so clearly violated those principles. And for Zoe, exhausted from finals and just wanting to get home, it was yet another reminder of the additional burden she carried navigating through spaces where her belonging was routinely questioned. The aircraft climbed through cloud layers, leaving Hartsfield-Jackson Airport behind. But the story that had unfolded at Gate D14 was just beginning its journey through corporate offices, social media feeds, and news cycles across the country. Professional response. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Marcus Mitchell's phone buzzed with a secure message. Blue Sky executives had a dedicated communication channel that bypassed the usual in-flight restrictions, allowing essential business operations to continue even at 35,000 feet. The message was from David Williams, VP of Operations. "Crisis team activated, code 4872 initiated, board chair briefed, PR preparing statement, need your guidance on approach. This is spreading fast." Code 4872 was Blue Sky's emergency protocol for high-priority incidents with potential public relations impact, a system Marcus himself had implemented after watching other airlines mishandle similar situations. It ensured that the right people were immediately engaged, that evidence was preserved, and that the company responded with appropriate urgency. "I need to handle this," Marcus said to Zoe apologetically. "We've got procedures in place for situations like this, but they still need executive guidance." Zoe nodded understanding. "Do what you need to do. I think I'm going to try to sleep for a bit anyway." She readjusted her neck pillow and closed her eyes, though sleep seemed unlikely given the adrenaline still coursing through her system. Marcus stepped to the rear of the aircraft where a small crew area afforded some privacy for a phone call. The lead flight attendant, recognizing the gravity of the situation, ensured he wasn't disturbed. While Marcus engaged with his executive team, activity on the ground continued at a frantic pace. At Blue Sky corporate headquarters, the crisis management team had assembled in the main conference room. Representatives from legal, HR, public relations, customer experience, and flight operations were reviewing the videos that had already been uploaded to social media. PR Director Ryan Parker, 38, white, with the polished appearance of someone who had guided companies through multiple public relations challenges, was drafting a statement with his team. "We need to be clear, direct, and unequivocal," he instructed, pacing behind his team as they worked. "No corporate speak, no 'we regret if anyone was offended' nonsense. This was a clear violation of our values and policies, and our response needs to reflect that." Ryan's assistant showed him the latest social media metrics. The original live stream has hit 172,000 views. We've been tagged over 15,000 times in the last hour. CNN is requesting a statement. "Acknowledged," Ryan said, scanning the draft statement on his tablet. "This needs to go out within the next 30 minutes. We can't afford to seem hesitant or defensive." In Atlanta, Ashley Morgan was interviewing witnesses who had volunteered to provide statements before continuing to their own flights. Emily Rodriguez gave a detailed account. The discrimination was obvious to everyone watching. The flight attendant let multiple white passengers board with bags the same size or larger, then singled out Miss Mitchell for extra scrutiny. When Ms. Mitchell proved her bag fit in the sizer, the flight attendant still refused to let her board. It was textbook discrimination. Emily checked her Twitter notifications. My post about this has been shared over 2,000 times in the last hour. I've already had 3 news outlets contact me for permission to use my video. Jackson Taylor shared a download link for his entire live stream before boarding his connecting flight. I've never seen anything like it. The flight attendant kept escalating the situation, calling security, using words like belligerent and criminal when the passenger was completely calm. Then when the CEO showed up, you could literally see the blood drain from her face. It was like watching karma in real time. At the Blue Sky Employee Lounge, word had spread rapidly among the staff. Flight aid crews arriving for their shifts were met with urgent briefings about maintaining professionalism and following company policies precisely. The message was clear: what had happened at Gate D14 would not be tolerated, and similar incidents would have severe consequences. Karen Winters had been escorted to a private office where HR representatives were conducting an initial interview. The conversation was not going well. Rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing, Karen had adopted a defensive position, insisting she had merely been enforcing company policies and that the passenger, even after being identified as the CEO's daughter, had demonstrated an attitude that concerned her. This is completely unfair, Karen insisted, her voice rising. I'm being scapegoated for doing my job. If she wasn't the CEO's daughter, none of this would be happening. The HR representative's response was measured but firm. Ms. Winters, we have multiple videos showing you allowed other passengers with similar or larger bags to board without issue. We have witness statements confirming you escalated a routine situation unnecessarily. We have your own words, recorded calling a passenger a criminal for attempting to answer her phone. This isn't about who her father is. This is about your behavior violating multiple company policies. On social media, the story was exploding beyond Blue Sky's ability to contain it. Traditional media outlets had picked up on the trending hashtag, with reporters reaching out to the company for statements. Several civil rights organizations had already issued comments condemning the incident as yet another example of the discrimination Black travelers routinely faced. Back on the aircraft, Marcus concluded his call with the crisis team and returned to his seat. Zoe had managed to fall asleep, the exhaustion of finals week and the emotional drain of the confrontation finally catching up with her. He gently adjusted her blanket and then opened his tablet to review the draft statement his team had prepared. The statement was direct and unequivocal. Blue Sky Airways acknowledges that a serious incident occurred today at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport involving discriminatory treatment of a passenger by one of our employees. The behavior shown in videos circulating online violates our core values and explicit policies. The employee involved has been removed from service pending investigation. We are reaching out to affected passengers directly to apologize. We are reviewing all relevant protocols and will take appropriate corrective action. At Blue Sky, we are committed to creating an inclusive environment where all passengers are treated with dignity and respect. When we fall short of that commitment, as we clearly did today, we have an obligation to acknowledge it, address it transparently, and take concrete steps to ensure it doesn't happen again. We will provide updates as our investigation proceeds. Marcus made a few edits, strengthening the language further and adding a personal note as CEO, then sent it back to the team with approval to release immediately. As the statement went live on Blue Sky's social media accounts and website, the response was immediate. Comments flooded in, many expressing surprise at the company's direct acknowledgement rather than the corporate deflection many had expected. Industry observers noted the unusual speed and clarity of the response, a departure from the typically cautious, legally vetted statements that characterize most corporate crisis communications. On the ground, the wheels of consequence were already turning. Karen Winters' 24-year career with Blue Sky Airways was effectively over. Though the specific terms of her separation were still being determined, the company's initial investigation had already uncovered enough evidence to justify immediate termination with cause. but the legal team was carefully reviewing all options to ensure the response was both appropriate and defensible. For the other passengers on Flight 724, the drama had provided an unexpected window into corporate accountability in action. As the story of what had happened at the gate spread through the cabin, Marcus found himself the recipient of supportive nods and approving glances from travelers who appreciated seeing a company leader personally involved in addressing discrimination. When a flight attendant announced that the flight would be arriving in San Francisco approximately 20 minutes behind schedule, due to a departure delay in Atlanta, a knowing murmur rippled through the cabin. This wasn't just any delay, it was already becoming a case study in consequences. A story passengers would tell friends and colleagues for years to come. I was on that flight, the one where the flight attendant tried to stop a black girl from boarding over her bag size, and it turned out she was the CEO's daughter. You should have seen his face when he showed up at the gate. Immediate corporate response, 6:30 p.m., emergency executive meeting. While Flight 724 was still crossing the continent, the executive leadership of Blue Sky Airways had convened in the glass-walled conference room that occupied the corner of the 35th floor at corporate headquarters. The emergency meeting, called under the Code 4872 protocol, had brought together department heads from across the company, many connecting virtually from various locations. On the message screen, dominating one wall, a compilation of videos captured at Gate D14 played silently, different angles of the same confrontation, all documenting Karen Winter's escalating hostility and Zoe's remarkable composure. The executives watched with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright dismay. "The footage is unambiguous," said Sofia Vega, the company's 43-year-old Hispanic legal counsel, pausing the video on a frame where Karen was visibly confronting Zoe. "We have multiple recordings from different sources, all showing the same pattern of discriminatory treatment. From a liability perspective, this is about as clear-cut as it gets." She tapped the screen, advancing to another clip. This moment, where Ms. Winters calls Ms. Mitchell a criminal for attempting to answer her phone, is particularly problematic from a legal standpoint. It demonstrates a clear bias in how she perceived and characterized a passenger who had done nothing wrong. David Williams, VP of Operations, a distinguished white man of 55 with salt and pepper hair and the measured speech of someone who chose his words carefully, nodded agreement. "I've reviewed the witness statements collected by Ashley's team. Multiple passengers confirmed that Ms. Winters allowed white travelers with similar or larger bags to board without issue, then specifically targeted Ms. Mitchell for extra scrutiny. When Ms. Mitchell demonstrated her compliance with our policies by using the sizer, Ms. Winters still refused to allow boarding." He rubbed his forehead, genuine distress evident in his expression. "This isn't a gray area or a misunderstanding. It's a textbook example of discriminatory treatment." Ryan Parker, the communications director, checked his tablet for the latest social media metrics. The story has gone viral across multiple platforms. Hashtag Blue Sky Shame is trending nationally. The original live stream has been viewed over 172,000 times. Major news outlets are picking it up. CNN is running it in their next hour. This isn't going away. He swiped through several screens of analytics. The public response to our initial statement has been largely positive. People appreciate the directness and lack of corporate obfuscation, but they're watching closely to see if our actions match our words. The gravity of the situation was not lost on anyone present. While corporations often face public relations challenges, this one struck at the heart of Blue Sky's brand identity. The company had spent years positioning itself as a progressive, inclusive organization that valued diversity, claims now being scrutinized in light of what had happened in Atlanta. "What's the status on Ms. Winters?" asked Janet Friedman, Chief Human Resources Officer, a 60-year-old white woman who had been with the company through 2 mergers and countless restructurings. Ashley Morgan, who had returned from the airport and joined the meeting, consulted her notes. "She's currently on administrative leave pending formal review. Initial interview was not productive. She's maintaining that she was simply enforcing company policies and denies any discriminatory intent. When confronted with evidence that she treated other passengers differently, she claimed she didn't recall those interactions." Janet sighed. "And her personnel file," Ashley grimaced slightly. "This isn't the first complaint. Over the past 5 years, there have been 7 formal complaints about Ms. Winters' treatment of passengers of color. None resulted in disciplinary action beyond verbal coaching. A troubled murmur ran through the room. 7 complaints with no meaningful action represented a systemic failure, a pattern that should have been addressed long before it escalated to this public incident. Sofia Vega's expression was grave. From a legal standpoint, that pattern creates additional liability. It suggests we were aware of the problem and failed to take appropriate corrective action. The virtual door chimed as Marcus Mitchell joined the meeting from the aircraft, his image appearing on a secondary screen. Despite the 5-hour flight and the stress of the situation, he looked composed and focused. "I've been following the discussion," he said, having connected shortly before Ashley's report on Karen's history. "Let me be clear about our approach here. This isn't just about managing a PR crisis or limiting liability. This is about confronting a failure in our culture and our systems. Ms. Winters' behavior today was abhorrent, but our failure to address similar behavior in the past makes us complicit." The directness of his assessment sent a ripple through the room. Corporate leaders often danced around such admissions, preferring euphemisms and deflection to outright acknowledgement of organizational failure. "I want a complete audit of all similar complaints across the company for the past 5 years," Marcus continued, his voice steady but firm. "I want to know how many were filed, how they were handled, and what patterns emerge. If we have other employees with multiple unaddressed complaints, I want to know immediately." David Williams nodded, making notes. "We'll initiate that first thing tomorrow morning." "No," Marcus said firmly. "We start tonight. This isn't a routine review that can wait for business hours. We have a fundamental breakdown in our systems, and I want to understand the full scope immediately." The urgency in his voice made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "What about Ms. Winters?" Janet asked. "Given the evidence and the public nature of the incident, I'm prepared to recommend immediate termination with cause." Marcus considered this. "I agree termination is appropriate, but I want our response to be measured and defensible." "Sophia, what's your recommendation from a legal perspective?" The attorney was thoughtful. "Termination is justified given the evidence. However, I would recommend a formal hearing process following our established protocols, even if expedited. That protects us from claims of arbitrary dismissal and ensures the outcome is based on a thorough review rather than public pressure." "Agreed," Marcus said. "Schedule the hearing for tomorrow morning. Ensure Ms. Winters has the opportunity to present her perspective, but make it clear that the evidence against her is substantial." Ryan Parker spoke up. "Sir, our initial statement has received generally positive response for its directness, but people are asking what specific actions we're taking. They want more than words." Marcus nodded. "Draft a follow-up statement outlining concrete steps, the audit of past complaints, the review of our training programs, and the development of new protocols to prevent similar incidents. Be specific about timelines and accountability measures." As the meeting continued, the focus shifted from immediate crisis management to systemic solutions. Marcus guided the discussion toward the root causes rather than just the symptoms. The corporate culture that had allowed Karen Winters to accumulate 7 complaints without consequence, the training gaps that had failed to address biased behavior, the reporting mechanisms that hadn't escalated serious issues appropriately. "This incident doesn't exist in isolation," he emphasized. "It's a symptom of deeper issues we need to address. I want solutions that go beyond disciplining one employee or issuing public apologies. I want structural change." By the time the meeting concluded, a comprehensive action plan had been developed with clear owners and timelines. What had begun as crisis management had evolved into something more significant, a commitment to organizational transformation triggered by a single, very public failure. As the executives filed out of the conference room, David Williams lingered to speak with Marcus privately through the video link. "Marcus," he said once they were alone, "how's Zoe doing?" The question shifted Marcus from CEO back to father, his professional mask softening slightly. "She's sleeping now, exhausted from finals, and then this situation. She handled it with remarkable composure." David nodded. "She shouldn't have had to. I'm sorry this happened on my watch, in my operation." "It's not about whose watch it was, David," Marcus replied. "It's about the environment we've all created, or failed to create. Zoe experienced what countless other passengers have experienced, without the benefit of being the CEO's daughter. The difference is that she had immediate recourse that others don't. The observation hung between them, a recognition of both privilege and responsibility that would shape the company's response in the days to come. Viral explosion. The digital life cycle of the Gate D14 incident unfolded with the algorithmic efficiency that characterizes the modern attention economy. What began as a live stream viewed by a few thousand people morphed into a viral phenomenon that transcended platforms and traditional media boundaries. By 8 p.m. Eastern Time, the metrics told a story of exponential spread. Jackson Taylor's original live stream had been viewed over 172,000 times before he ended the broadcast upon boarding his connecting flight. But clips extracted from that stream, particularly the moment when Karen called Zoe a criminal and the revelation when Marcus Mitchell arrived at the gate, had taken on lives of their own. On TikTok, a 60-second edit focusing on Karen's most egregious statements had accumulated 8.7 million views under the hashtag #BlueSkyShame. The video opened with Karen's dismissive, "People like you always think rules don't apply," and ended with her shocked expression as Marcus revealed his identity. The comment section had exploded with users sharing their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. "This happened to me last week on a different airline, same exact situation, but no CEO dad to save me. I'm a frequent flyer with platinum status and still get randomly selected for additional screening every time. Not me watching this while sitting at the gate where this went down. The employees are all whispering about it. Notice how none of the white passengers stepped in to help. Just recorded it happening. Speaks volumes." Karen was giving big, "you're in the wrong neighborhood" energy. Twitter was equally ablaze with activity. Emily Rodriguez's initial post with her recording had been retweeted over 142,000 times. Civil rights organizations, travel advocates, and celebrities with large platforms had amplified the story, turning a single incident into a national conversation about bias in the travel industry. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, had issued a statement. "What happened at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport today is not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of discrimination that Black travelers face daily. We commend Blue Sky Airways for their swift acknowledgement, but emphasize that real change requires structural reforms, not just statements." On Instagram, where visual impact drove engagement, side-by-side comparisons showed Karen allowing white passengers with larger bags to board while stopping Zoe with her clearly compliant luggage. These posts had accumulated over 3.4 million shares within hours. Infographics explaining what to do if you witness discrimination while traveling were being created and shared by social justice accounts. The hashtag travel, while Black had emerged as a secondary trend, with travelers sharing their own experiences of discrimination in airports, hotels, and other travel contexts. Over 27,000 personal stories had been shared under this tag, creating a powerful collective narrative that placed the Gate D14 incident in a broader social context. "Had to show my boarding pass 4 times between security and my seat, while my white colleagues walked right through #travel. While Black. Flight attendant told me I was in the wrong seat in first class even after I showed her my boarding pass. Twice. She kept insisting until another FA corrected her #travel while Black. Security pulled me aside to randomly check my bag while letting a stream of white passengers pass. What's random about being the only Black person in line? #travel while Black." Mainstream media had quickly recognized the story's significance. CNN ran a segment titled "Discrimination at 30,000 Feet," featuring an interview with a civil rights attorney who specialized in transportation issues. Fox News approached the story from a different angle, focusing on the CEO's direct involvement and questioning whether the incident would have received similar attention if the passenger hadn't been connected. MSNBC brought on a panel of travel industry experts to discuss the systemic nature of discrimination in air travel. The business impact was immediate and measurable. Blue Sky's stock had dropped 4% by market close, a significant single-day movement for a major airline. Investment analysts were issuing updates to clients, speculating about the potential long-term effects on brand value and customer loyalty. Competitors were watching closely, some expressing public solidarity while privately reviewing their own training programs and complaint histories to ensure they weren't vulnerable to similar incidents. 3 celebrities with substantial followings had shared their own experiences of discrimination, While traveling, A-list actress Gabriela Mendoza posted, "What happened to Zoe Mitchell today has happened to me multiple times, even after being on magazine covers. The difference is I didn't have a CEO father to intervene. This is the reality of hashtag travel while black." Grammy-winning musician Derek Johnson shared, "I was removed from a first-class cabin last year despite having a valid ticket because a flight attendant couldn't believe it was my seat. Even fame doesn't protect you from this kind of treatment." NBA star Tyrone Williams tweeted, "They see a 6'8" black man, and suddenly the first-class seat I paid for is having a technical issue and needs to be downgraded. Happens so often I started recording every interaction at airports. Hashtag travel while black is exhausting." These high-profile testimonials transformed the narrative from an isolated incident involving one passenger and one flight attendant to a widespread pattern affecting travelers across demographics, including those with the wealth, fame, and public platforms, revealing the pervasiveness of the issue in ways that resonated with broader audiences. For Blue Sky Airways, the viral explosion created both crisis and opportunity. The crisis was obvious, a public relations nightmare, potential legal liability, damage to brand reputation, and employee morale issues. But within that crisis lay an opportunity to demonstrate authentic leadership, to implement meaningful reforms that could position the company as an industry leader in addressing a problem that affected the entire sector. Marcus Mitchell, watching the digital firestorm unfold from the confines of Flight 724, recognized both aspects. As a CEO, he saw the business imperative to manage the crisis effectively. As a black man who had faced similar treatment throughout his life, he understood the deeper significance of the moment. And as Zoe's father, he felt the personal impact of seeing his daughter subjected to the same biases he had hoped his generation's progress might have diminished for hers. The plane continued its westward journey as the story of what had happened at Gate D14 spread east, west, north, and south, crossing not just geographical boundaries, but the invisible lines between social media platforms, traditional news outlets, corporate boardrooms, and dinner table conversations across the country. Family processing. The Mitchell family home in Atlanta's Cascade Heights neighborhood was an architectural statement of understated elegance, a modern interpretation of Southern traditional design with clean lines and warm materials. The sprawling main level featured an open kitchen that flowed into a comfortable family room, where the Mitchells now gathered 2 days after the airport incident. Marcus had extended his stay in San Francisco to support Zoe and accompany her home, rearranging his schedule to prioritize family over the corporate crisis that continued unfolding at Blue Sky. They had arrived back in Atlanta that afternoon, weary from travel but relieved to be home. Diana Mitchell, 49, moved with practiced efficiency around the kitchen island as she prepared a light dinner. Her natural hair was styled in a short, sophisticated cut that framed her face, highlighting cheekbones that Zoe had inherited. As a federal judge, she brought the same focused intensity to family discussions that she did to her courtroom. "I've watched that video 17 times, Diana said, her voice controlled but with an undercurrent of maternal fury as she chopped vegetables with precise, forceful strokes. "Each time, I find something new to be outraged about. The way she invaded your personal space, the way she called for security, with no justification, the casual cruelty of calling you a criminal for trying to answer your phone." She set down the knife she'd been using with a bit more force than necessary, betraying the emotion beneath her measured tone. "The fact that this woman felt comfortable treating you that way, that she assumed there would be no consequences, says everything about the environment she's been operating in." Zoe sat at the island, absently scrolling through messages on her phone. The incident had transformed her into a reluctant symbol overnight. Friends from Stanford were checking in constantly. Strangers were sending support through social media. News outlets were requesting interviews. It was overwhelming. "I keep thinking about how differently it would have ended if Dad hadn't been there," Zoe said quietly. "I would have been removed from the flight, might have been banned from the airline, would have missed the last connection home. All because one person decided my bag was suddenly a problem when identical bags carried by white passengers weren't." Elijah Mitchell, Zoe's 22-year-old brother and a senior at Morehouse College, leaned against the refrigerator, his expression thoughtful as he opened a sparkling water. "That's what makes this story powerful. Though everyone can see the before and after, how you were treated initially, and how everything changed the instant they realized who Dad was. It exposes the whole system. He took a sip, then continued. You know what's really telling? The comments on those videos. White people are shocked. Black people are just nodding like, yep, happens every day. It's that disconnect that keeps this stuff going. Diana nodded agreement. It's the perfect case study in how privilege and power intersect with race. You were treated poorly because of racial bias, then received immediate justice because of proximity to power. Most people experiencing that same discrimination have no recourse. She arranged the vegetables on a platter with the same precision she brought to organizing legal arguments. I've had defendants in my courtroom who've received harsher sentences than this flight attendant will face, despite causing far less harm. That's the reality of our justice system. Consequences depend not just on what you did, but on who you are and who you did it to. Marcus entered from his home office, where he'd been on calls with his executive team for much of the afternoon. Despite the casual setting, he carried himself with the same quiet authority he displayed in corporate boardrooms, though the lines around his eyes betrayed the fatigue of managing both a family crisis and a corporate one simultaneously. The hearing concluded this morning, he announced. Karen Winters has been terminated for cause, effective immediately. The review panel was unanimous. The news landed with complex resonance in the room. There was satisfaction in the appropriate consequence, but no real joy. Just the grim recognition that justice had been served in this case while countless similar situations went unaddressed daily. What's happening with the policy review? Diana asked, her legal mind focused on systemic solutions rather than individual punishment. Marcus joined them at the island. We've assembled a task force to conduct a comprehensive audit of all our policies and training programs. Dr. Gabriela Mendez is consulting. She's the leading expert on bias prevention in customer service industries. Initial findings should be ready next week. He accepted the glass of water Diana handed him with a grateful nod. The preliminary audit results are troubling. We've uncovered at least 37 similar complaints in the past year alone that were dismissed with no meaningful follow-up. Zoe looked up from her phone. I've been invited to speak at a student forum on travel discrimination when I return to campus. I'm not sure if I should accept. Diana turned to her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. That's entirely your choice, Zoe. You didn't ask to become the face of this issue. You have every right to decline and focus on your studies. But you also have a platform now that most people never get, Elijah countered, leaning forward. You could help change things for students who don't have a CEO dad to intervene when this happens to them. Your story is powerful precisely because it shows both the discrimination and the privilege in one package. Zoe nodded, considering. That's what makes it complicated. I don't want to be centered in a narrative about discrimination when so many people face worse with no resolution. That's exactly why your voice could matter, Marcus said. You can acknowledge your privilege while using it to highlight the experiences of those without similar recourse. That's not taking center stage. It's using your momentary spotlight to illuminate a larger issue. The family fell silent for a moment, each considering the balance between personal peace and public responsibility, between moving on from an uncomfortable experience and using it to drive meaningful change. I keep thinking about the other passengers, Zoe said finally. The ones who recorded what was happening but didn't speak up until Dad arrived. The ones who saw the unfairness but stayed silent. What would have made them intervene sooner? Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's actually the most important question in all of this. Individual accountability for Karen Winters is appropriate, but the broader culture, both within our company and in society, is what allowed her to act with such confidence that she wouldn't be challenged. Diana finished preparing the salad and began distributing it to plates. What we're really talking about is the bystander effect, the diffusion of responsibility that happens when multiple people witness an injustice but assume someone else will address it. Breaking that pattern requires specific training and cultural reinforcement, which is exactly what we're implementing at Blue Sky, Marcus added. Not just for our employees, but tools and information for passengers as well. How to recognize bias, how to safely intervene, how to document effectively. Elijah reached for his plate. What about legal consequences? Beyond losing her job? Diana, with her judicial perspective, shook her head slightly. Employment termination is likely the extent of formal consequences in a case like this. While her behavior was discriminatory and reprehensible, it doesn't rise to the level of criminal conduct under current laws. That doesn't seem enough, Zoe said quietly, pushing her food around her plate. She tried to have me removed by security, labeled me a criminal in front of dozens of witnesses. If Dad hadn't been there, my entire break could have been disrupted, not to mention the academic consequences of missing my summer research position start date. Marcus placed a supportive hand on his daughter's shoulder. You're right. It isn't enough. That's why the systemic changes are so important. We can't undo what happened to you, but we can work to prevent it from happening to others. The conversation continued through dinner, weaving between personal processing and policy discussions, between the emotional impact on their family and the broader implications for society. It was a dialogue that reflected their collective experience: Diana's legal expertise, Marcus's corporate leadership, Elijah's academic perspective, and Zoe's lived reality as a young Black woman navigating spaces where her belonging was routinely questioned. As the evening progressed, they moved from the kitchen to the more comfortable setting of the family room, where news coverage of the incident played on mute on the large television mounted on the wall. The surreal experience of seeing their family's private moment of trauma transformed into a national conversation about race, power, and accountability was not lost on any of them. I'm proud of how you handled yourself, Marcus told Zoe as the evening wound down. You showed remarkable composure in a situation designed to make you lose your cool. You knew your rights, you documented everything, you articulated your position clearly. You did everything we've ever talked about for situations like this. Zoe managed a tired smile, but I kept hearing your voice into my head the whole time. Stay calm, though. Know the rules better than they do. Document everything. Diana's expression was more somber. The fact that we have to have those conversations, that we have to prepare our children for how to respond when they're inevitably discriminated against, is itself an indictment of how far we still have to go. The comment hung in the air, a reminder that their family's ability to achieve some measure of justice in this situation was the exception rather than the rule. For every Zoe Mitchell with a CEO father who could intervene, there were countless travelers facing similar discrimination without recourse, without witnesses willing to speak up, without the power to ensure consequences. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, media inquiries, legal considerations, the complex work of institutional change. But for tonight, they were simply a family, processing a shared experience that had revealed hard truths about the world they navigated together. Karen's perspective. Karen Winters sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the mementos of a 24-year airline career that had ended in disgrace just hours earlier. Framed photos from crew gatherings over the decades, model planes bearing the logos of Atlantic Coast Airways and then Blue Sky after the merger. Service pins marking milestones, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that had once been sources of pride, but now seemed to mock her from their display case. The formal termination letter lay on her coffee table, its legal language clinical and devastating. Terminated for cause, effective immediately. Violation of company policies regarding discriminatory treatment of passengers. Conduct unbecoming a representative of Blue Sky Airways. For the third time that evening, Karen poured herself a glass of white wine, her hand trembling slightly as she filled the glass too full, spilling a few drops on the polished wood. The past 72 hours had been a nightmare from which she couldn't seem to wake. The confrontation at Gate D14, the humiliation when Marcus Mitchell revealed himself as the CEO, the administrative leave, the hearing that morning where the evidence against her had been presented with devastating thoroughness. Her phone buzzed with another message, but she didn't check it. Most recent communications fell into two categories: colleagues distancing themselves with performative outrage, or acquaintances wanting insider details about the incident that had gone viral. Neither offered comfort or support. Karen had spent the first 24 hours after the incident in a state of defensive indignation, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had simply been enforcing company policies. But as videos from multiple angles circulated online, as witness statements accumulated, as the evidence of her selective enforcement became incontrovertible, that position became increasingly untenable. She had tried a different approach at the formal hearing, acknowledging that she had been perhaps overzealous, but attributing it to stress, to concerns about on-time departure, to misunderstanding company policies. Those explanations withered under questioning when the review panel presented her with side-by-side comparisons, white passengers with larger bags allowed to board without comment. Zoe Mitchell's bag fitting easily in the sizer yet still deemed non-compliant. The panel had been diverse: 3 men, 4 women, multiple ethnicities, but their assessment had been unanimous. Her behavior violated company policies, contradicted training protocols, and reflected discriminatory treatment that could not be justified or excused. Now, alone with the consequences of her actions, Karen confronted the question that had been lurking at the edges of her consciousness. Why had she done it? What had driven her to target that particular passenger so aggressively when others with similar or larger bags had boarded without issue? The easy answer, the one she had initially clung to, was that she had simply been enforcing rules consistently. But the videos destroyed that claim, showing her wave through passenger after passenger until Zoe Mitchell approached with her burgundy tote. Was it because Zoe was young? Because she wore a university hoodie rather than business attire? Because she seemed tired and thus potentially less likely to push back against authority? Or was it, as the review panel had concluded, because Zoe Mitchell was Black? Karen had vehemently denied that accusation. "I don't have a racist bone in my body," she had insisted, using the phrase that had become a cliché of defensive denial. "I treat all passengers the same," but the evidence said otherwise. And in the privacy of her apartment, with her career in ruins and her reputation destroyed, the uncomfortable truth began to penetrate her defenses. She hadn't consciously thought, "I'm going to discriminate against this passenger because of her race." The process had been more insidious than that. She had seen a young Black woman in casual clothes and made instant, unconscious assessments about her belonging, her compliance, her right to take up space in the premium cabin of a commercial aircraft. Those assessments hadn't happened in a vacuum. They had been shaped by a lifetime of media images, social conditioning, and unchallenged assumptions about who belonged in which spaces. They had been reinforced by 24 years in an industry where first-class cabins remained predominantly white and where subtle cues about passenger status were embedded in everything from boarding procedures to service protocols. Karen's phone buzzed again. This time she checked it. A text from Sandra, another senior flight attendant. "Saw the news. Can't believe they fired you over one incident. This company has changed. Call me." The message offered the comfort of shared indignation, but Karen didn't respond. Something had shifted in her understanding. The videos didn't show one incident. They showed her character, her biases, her exercise of authority in ways she had never fully examined. Her first paycheck would be missed next week. The mortgage on her condo suddenly seemed precarious. Her health insurance would end at the month's close. The practical consequences of her termination were beginning to materialize alongside the professional and social fallout. Karen navigated to Twitter, where her name was still trending. The comments were brutal, with strangers dissecting her every expression, her tone, her body language in the gate videos. Some called for her to be blacklisted from the entire airline industry. Others suggested criminal charges for discrimination. A few defended her, but their arguments often contained explicit racism that only confirmed the bias evident in her actions. A notification popped up on her screen, a news alert featuring an interview with Marcus Mitchell on a major network. Reluctantly, she pressed play. The CEO appeared composed and thoughtful as the interviewer asked about the incident. What happened at Gate D14 wasn't just about one employee or one passenger. Mitchell said, "It revealed systemic issues in how we train our staff, how we handle complaints, and how we create a culture of accountability. Miss Winter's behavior was unacceptable, and she has been terminated. But focusing solely on her individual actions misses the broader pattern that allowed such behavior to go unchecked across multiple prior incidents." Karen felt a chill. Multiple prior incidents. They had found the other complaints, the ones that had been dismissed or downplayed over the years, the patterns she herself had never recognized. Mitchell continued, "We're implementing comprehensive reforms in training, reporting mechanisms, and accountability structures. We're partnering with the civil rights organizations to develop better protocols. And we're creating clear channels for passengers to report discriminatory treatment, with guaranteed review processes that don't rely on the passenger having personal connections to corporate leadership." The interviewer leaned forward. "Your daughter handled herself with remarkable composure throughout the confrontation. How did she develop that presence of mind at just 19 years old? Marcus's expression shifted subtly, professional to personal. Unfortunately, she's had practice. Like many Black Americans, my wife and I have had to prepare our children for these situations, teaching them to stay calm, to know their rights, to document everything. No parent should have to have those conversations. But until the world changes, we do what's necessary to protect our children. Karen turned off the video, unable to watch further. The CEO's words had cut through her remaining defenses. This wasn't about corporate policies or customer service protocols. It was about human dignity and the casual cruelty with which she had stripped it from a young woman who had done nothing wrong except exist in a space Karen had unconsciously deemed inappropriate for her. The reflection in her darkened phone screen showed a woman she barely recognized, someone whose self-image as a professional, as a fair person, as a good employee had been shattered by the incontrovertible evidence of her own behavior. The path forward was unclear. Her skills were specialized to an industry that would likely not welcome her return. Her professional references were now worthless. Her financial security, tied to a career she had expected to continue for at least another decade, was suddenly precarious. But as she sat among the artifacts of her airline career, Karen Winters faced something more fundamental than practical concerns about employment or finances. She confronted the recognition that her actions had revealed aspects of herself she had never acknowledged, biases she had never examined, authority she had wielded carelessly, harm she had caused without consideration. It wasn't a comfortable reckoning, but it was a necessary one, the first step toward whatever came next. As she stared at the termination letter, a memory surfaced from early in her career, a Black passenger in first class whom she'd repeatedly asked to show his boarding pass. A senior flight attendant pulling her aside afterward. "Karen, we don't need to check their tickets quite so many times." She'd been defensive then too, insisting she was just being thorough. But was she? Or had that been the first manifestation of a pattern she'd never confronted? She picked up her phone again, but instead of returning Sandra's text with comforting agreement, she opened her browser and typed, "Unconscious bias training, near me." It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless in the grand scheme, but it represented something she hadn't been capable of even 24 hours earlier, the possibility that she had been wrong not just in this instance, but in ways that required genuine self-examination. The screen filled with results, workshops, online courses, community programs. Karen scrolled through them, not yet committed but no longer dismissing the very concept of bias as something that happened to other people, never to her. Systematic changes begin. 2 weeks after the incident at Gate D14, the Mitchell Protocol was taking shape. Named not after the CEO but after his daughter, whose experience had catalyzed the transformation, it represented the most comprehensive bias prevention initiative in the airline industry's history. In a glass-walled conference room at Blue Sky headquarters, Marcus Mitchell stood before a detailed presentation outlining the 37-point plan that would reshape the company's approach to customer service, employee training, and corporate accountability. "The audit results confirm what we suspected," he told the assembled leadership team. "Over the past 5 years, we've received 342 formal complaints alleging discriminatory treatment of passengers. Of those, only 28 resulted in any disciplinary action. The remaining 314 were dismissed as unsubstantiated or addressed through verbal coaching that had no documented follow-up. The statistics painted a damning picture of systematic failure, not just in addressing individual instances of discrimination, but in recognizing patterns that should have triggered organizational responses years earlier. Even more concerning," Marcus continued, "we found that complaints from minority passengers were 64% less likely to result in formal action than similar complaints from white passengers. Our internal review processes have been fundamentally biased in whose experiences we validate and whose we dismiss." The presentation shifted to a detailed implementation timeline for the Mitchell Protocol Week 1-2 completed. Comprehensive audit of all discrimination complaints for the past 5 years. Termination of Karen Winters following formal hearing. Public acknowledgement of the incident and commitment to reform. Formation of a 12-person bias prevention task force. Week 3-4 current phase. Development of new training to curriculum with Dr. Gabriela Mendez. Revision of baggage policy language to eliminate subjective enforcement. implementation of recording protocols for all boarding disputes, creation of an independent review board for discrimination complaints. Week 5-8, upcoming. Mandatory retraining for all customer-facing staff, 4,732 employees, installation of AI monitoring systems to identify patterns of selective enforcement, launch of passenger reporting app with direct link to corporate review team, development of bystander intervention protocols for crew members. Week 9-12, integration of bias prevention metrics into performance reviews, implementation of mystery shopper program focusing on equitable treatment, revision of hiring practices to prioritize candidates with demonstrated cultural competence, partnership with civil rights organizations for ongoing program evaluation. David Williams, VP of Operations, studied the timeline with a mixture of approval and concern. This is the most aggressive transformation initiative I've seen in 30 years in the airline industry. I fully support it, but I want to make sure we're setting realistic expectations for our team. This represents a fundamental shift in how we operate. Marcus nodded acknowledgement. It is aggressive because it needs to be. What happened to Zoe wasn't an isolated incident. It was the visible tip of a much larger problem. Half measures won't address the underlying issues. Dr. Gabriela Mendez, the 51-year-old Hispanic bias training specialist who had been brought in to lead the assessment, highlighted key findings from her initial review. Your current training program dedicates only 47 minutes to bias recognition and prevention out of a 40-hour onboarding process, she noted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in the field. For comparison, you spend 3 hours on beverage service protocols. That imbalance sends a clear message about priorities. Her assessment continued with specific recommendations. Increase bias prevention training from 47 minutes to 8 hours. Implement quarterly refresher courses rather than annual reviews. Develop scenario-based learning modules using real-life examples. Create peer mentorship programs pairing diverse staff members. Establish clear metrics for measuring improvement over time. The key insight from behavioral science research, Dr. Mendez explained, is that awareness alone doesn't change behavior. People need concrete skills, practical tools, and consistent accountability. They need to practice making different choices in realistic scenarios. The technology component of the Mitchell protocol was equally ambitious. Ryan Parker presented plans for an AI monitoring system that would analyze patterns of enforcement across the company. The system will flag statistical anomalies in how policies are applied across different passenger demographics. For example, if carry-on bags are being scrutinized at significantly different rates based on passenger characteristics, the system will identify that pattern for intervention before it escalates to incidents like what happened at Gate D14. He demonstrated the interface on a large screen. The dashboard allows supervisors to see real-time metrics on how consistently policies are being applied. It doesn't just identify potential bias. It provides coaching opportunities before problematic patterns become entrenched. Similar technology would be applied to complaint handling, ensuring that reports of discriminatory treatment received appropriate attention regardless of the passenger's status or connections. We're also implementing a passenger reporting application, Ryan explained, demonstrating the interface on a tablet. This gives travelers a direct channel to document and report concerning interactions in real time, with the option to include photo or video evidence. The app's sleek interface allowed passengers to describe incidents, upload documentation, and track resolution, all designed to create accountability that didn't depend on viral videos or CEO intervention. The comprehensive approach extended beyond Blue Sky's direct operations to its broader ecosystem of contractors, vendors, and partners. New contractual requirements would hold third parties to the same standards, ensuring that every touchpoint in the customer journey reflected the company's renewed commitment to equitable treatment. As the presentation concluded, Marcus addressed the underlying question that had hovered unspoken throughout the discussion. Why invest such significant resources, financial, human, technological, in addressing bias when many companies treated similar incidents as isolated PR challenges to be managed and forgotten? Some will view this as an overreaction to a single incident that happened to involve a CEO's family member. Marcus acknowledged, they'll suggest we're only doing this because of who Zoe is. That perspective misses the point entirely. He paused, ensuring his next words landed with appropriate weight. We're doing this not because my daughter was the passenger in this case, but because thousands of passengers who aren't related to anyone in this room have experienced similar treatment without the benefit of immediate intervention. We're doing this because it's a moral imperative and a business necessity. And we're doing it comprehensively because anything less would simply manage symptoms while leaving the underlying condition untreated. The Mitchell Protocol represented more than a corporate response to a public relations crisis. It was a recognition that meaningful change required systematic reimagining of structures, processes, and cultural norms that had enabled discriminatory behavior to persist despite stated values of inclusion and respect. As the meeting adjourned and executives dispersed to implement their assigned components of the protocol, the magnitude of the transformation became increasingly clear. What had begun as one passenger's humiliating experience at a boarding gate was catalyzing changes that would affect how thousands of employees interacted with millions of passengers across the entire Blue Sky network. The true test would come not in the eloquence of the plan or the sincerity of the commitment, but in the lived experience of travelers in the months and years ahead, particularly those who didn't have a CEO's direct intervention to ensure their dignity was respected and their rights protected. Karen's hearing. The formal hearing that would determine Karen Winter's professional fate convened at 9:00 a.m. in a sterile conference room on the 35th floor of Blue Sky corporate headquarters. The setting itself communicated the gravity of the proceedings, not a manager's office or a casual meeting space, but the formal environment typically reserved for board-level decisions and high-stakes negotiations. Karen entered wearing a navy suit that mirrored her former uniform without the Blue Sky insignia, a subconscious attempt to reclaim the professional identity that had been suspended along with her employment status. The dark circles under her eyes suggested sleepless nights, but her posture remained rigid with defensive pride. Across the polished conference table sat the 7-member review panel, 3 representatives from Human Resources, including Janet Friedman, 2 from Flight Operations, 1 from Legal, and 1 from Employee Relations. Their expressions were neutral but focused, their notepads and tablets arranged with precise alignment that suggested order and process. The evidence presented against Karen was comprehensive and meticulous. Video recordings from multiple angles showed her interactions with various passengers, highlighting the stark contrast in treatment. Witness statements corroborated the visual evidence. Previous complaint records established a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Ashley Morgan, leading the presentation for HR, displayed a side-by-side comparison on the large screen. At 3:38 p.m., Miss Winters processed passenger Taylor, white, female, approximately 30 years old, carrying a backpack and tote bag of comparable size to Mitchell's luggage. As you can see, Ms. Winters greeted her warmly and made no comment about her bags. The video played in silence, showing Karen's friendly interaction with the blonde passenger, including her helpful rearrangement of items to make the oversized bag appear compliant. The video advanced forward. At 3:42 p.m., Ms. Winters processed Mrs. Mitchell, black, female, 19 years old, carrying a backpack and tote bag that met all size requirements. She immediately challenged the baggage, despite clear evidence that it was compliant with company policies. This clip showed Karen's expression hardening, her body language becoming more confrontational as Zoe approached the counter. The contrast between the two interactions was stark and undeniable. Karen's attorney, a silver-haired man named Richard Palmer, who specialized in employment disputes, attempted to construct a defense around procedural issues rather than the substance of the allegations. My client was never properly trained on bias recognition, he argued, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to difficult defenses. The company provided only 47 minutes of diversity training during her orientation, with minimal refresher courses. If there were deficiencies in her approach to passenger interactions, that reflects inadequate preparation by Blue Sky, not intentional discrimination by Mrs. Winters. Janet Friedman's response was measured but firm. Mr. Palmer, we acknowledge the limitations in our training programs, which we are currently addressing through comprehensive reforms. However, basic human dignity and equitable treatment are not specialized skills that require extensive training. They are fundamental expectations for anyone in a customer service role. As the hearing progressed, Karen's defense strategy evolved from procedural objections to contextual justifications. That was an exceptionally busy day with a full flight, she explained during questioning, her voice tight with controlled tension. I was concerned about overhead bin space and was being more vigilant about bag sizes as a result. The flight operations representative countered with the boarding manifest. The flight was at 78% capacity at the time Ms. Mitchell approached the gate. There was ample overhead space available, a memo, as confirmed by the final boarding report. When confronted with the video showing her calling Zoe a criminal for attempting to answer her phone, Karen's composure cracked slightly. That was an unfortunate choice of words in a stressful moment. I didn't mean it literally. Sophia Vega from Legal leaned forward, her dark eyes focused intently on Karen. Ms. Winters, in your 24 years with this company, have you ever used that term to describe a white passenger in a similar situation? The question hung in the air, unanswerable in any way that would preserve Karen's position. After a moment of strained silence, her attorney interjected with objections about the question's speculative nature. But the damage was done. The pattern of differential treatment based on race had been established beyond reasonable dispute. 4 hours into the proceedings, as the evidence mounted and her defenses crumbled, Karen's demeanor underwent a subtle shift. The defensive posture softened slightly. The reflexive objections came less frequently. Something in her expression suggested the beginning of recognition, not yet accountability, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of denial she had constructed. During a brief recess, Karen stood alone by the window, looking out over the city from the 35th floor. The view was a reminder of what she had achieved in her career, the position of authority and respect she had earned over decades of service. But it also highlighted what she had risked and ultimately lost through actions she was only now beginning to truly examine. When the hearing resumed, Janet Friedman addressed Karen directly, setting aside the formality that had characterized the earlier proceedings. Ms. Winters, I've reviewed your entire employment history with Blue Sky Airways. For most of your career, you were rated as an exemplary employee. You received commendations for customer service, for mentoring junior staff, for operational excellence during challenging situations. That makes what happened at Gate D14 all the more difficult to reconcile. Karen nodded slightly. The first acknowledgement of the disconnect between her self-image as a professional and the evidence of her behavior. I would like to understand, Janet continued, from your perspective, what changed? Because the Karen Winters who began with this company was not someone who would humiliate a passenger in public, who would call a young woman a criminal for answering her phone, who would enforce policies selectively based on a passenger's appearance. It was an invitation, not to excuse her behavior, but to reflect on it with a degree of honesty that had been absent from her previous responses. For a moment, it seemed Karen might accept that invitation, might engage in the kind of self-examination that could be the first step toward meaningful accountability. Instead, she retreated to the safety of procedural language. I believe I was enforcing company policies as I understood them. If there were misunderstandings or miscommunications, I regret them. The panel exchanged glances that communicated a shared assessment. Karen remained unwilling or unable to acknowledge the fundamental nature of her actions. Without that recognition, any path to rehabilitation within the company was effectively closed. The deliberation phase was brief. The evidence was unambiguous. The pattern clear. The violation of company policies and values beyond dispute. The decision, when announced, was unanimous termination with cause, effective immediately. As Karen absorbed the finality of that judgment, the panel outlined the practical details, the surrender of her company credentials, the processing of her final paycheck, the termination of benefits at the end of the current month, the clinical administration of a career's end. Do you understand these terms as they've been presented? Janet asked, following the required protocol. Karen nodded, her voice barely audible as she responded, yes. With that acknowledgement, the formal hearing concluded. Karen gathered her belongings, a notepad on which she had written very little, a water bottle still mostly full, a folder containing documents that had failed to mount an effective defense. As she prepared to leave the room that had witnessed the official end of her 24-year career, Janet Friedman offered one final comment, not as part of the formal proceedings, but as a human being addressing another at a moment of profound transition. Ms. Winters, Janet said, her voice softening slightly. What happened at Gate D14 doesn't have to be the final chapter of your story. How you respond to this moment, whether you choose reflection and growth or continued denial, will determine what comes next for you. Karen paused at the door, the words landing with unexpected weight. For the briefest moment, something vulnerable flickered across her face. Perhaps the first genuine acknowledgement that her actions had consequences beyond her own career, that they had caused real harm to another human being. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the mask of composure she had maintained throughout most of the hearing. Without responding, she exited the conference room, the door closing quietly behind her, a subdued conclusion to a career that had spanned nearly a quarter century. The panel members remained seated, the weight of their decisions settling over the room. While the outcome had been inevitable given the evidence, there was no satisfaction in ending someone's livelihood, regardless of how justified that action might be. We need to ensure the systematic changes prevent similar situations, Janet said finally, breaking the silence. Terminating Ms. Winters addresses the immediate issue, but not the underlying conditions that allowed her behavior to go unchecked for so long. Sofia Vega nodded agreement. The Mitchell Protocol is ambitious, but this case demonstrates why it's necessary. The stakes are too high, both for our passengers and for employees like Ms. Winters, who may not recognize their own biases until it's too late. As the review panel gathered their materials and prepared to submit their formal recommendation, they understood that Karen's termination represented both an ending and a beginning, the conclusion of one employee's career with Blue Sky, but also the commencement of a broader transformation that would reshape the company's approach to equity, accountability, and human dignity. 3 months later, industry changes. The Grand Ballroom of the Atlanta Convention Center buzzed with anticipation as industry leaders from across the aviation sector gathered for the annual Air Transport Forum. The morning's keynote address had drawn particular interest. Marcus Mitchell's first major public appearance since the Gate D14 incident that had transformed Blue Sky Airways and sent ripples through the entire industry. As Marcus approached the podium, the room fell silent. His presence commanded attention not through intimidation, but through the quiet authority of someone whose actions had matched their words. For the past 3 months, Blue Sky had not simply managed a public relations crisis. They had fundamentally reimagined their approach to equitable service, setting new standards that were forcing competitors to reevaluate their own practices. 90 days ago, Marcus began, a passenger was humiliated at one of our gates because of unconscious bias and unchecked authority. That passenger happened to be my daughter, which meant the incident received attention and consequences that similar situations rarely do. The privilege that ensured justice in this case highlighted the lack of recourse available to countless travelers who don't have direct connections to corporate leadership. He paused, making eye contact with various executives in the audience, many of whom shifted uncomfortably in recognition of similar incidents within their own companies that had gone unaddressed. I could have treated this as a private matter, firing one employee, issuing a standard apology, and moving on with business as usual. Many companies have taken that approach to similar incidents. Instead, we chose to recognize it as a symptom of deeper issues requiring systematic solutions. The screen behind him displayed the first slide of his presentation, the Mitchell Protocol, 90 Days of Transformation. The results of our initial implementation have been remarkable. Marcus continued, bias complaints across Blue Sky operations have decreased by 84%. Customer satisfaction ratings have increased by 31% among all demographics, with the most significant improvements among passengers of color. Staff diversity in leadership roles has increased by 27% as we've recognized and promoted talent that was previously overlooked. These weren't vague promises of future improvement, but measurable outcomes from concrete changes. The 37-point Mitchell Protocol had been implemented with a thoroughness that reflected both corporate determination and personal commitment. The cornerstone of our approach has been accountability at every level. Marcus explained, we've established independent review channels for passenger complaints, removing the inherent conflicts when departments investigate themselves. We've implemented comprehensive bias training, not as a one-time workshop, but as an ongoing professional development requirement for all customer-facing staff. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a dramatic reduction in complaint dismissal rates. Previously, 92% of bias complaints were dismissed without meaningful action. That figure has dropped to 7%, and each of those dismissals requires multiple layers of review and documentation. The presentation highlighted specific technological innovations that supported these cultural changes. Eye monitoring systems that identified patterns of differential treatment in real-time passenger reporting applications that provided direct channels for documenting concerns, data analytics platforms that measured policy enforcement across demographic groups, simulation training modules that prepared staff for challenging scenarios. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus noted, we've created consequences not just for explicit discrimination, but for the passive enabling that allows bias to flourish unchecked. Managers are now evaluated not only on operational metrics, but on equity indicators within their teams. The impact extended beyond Blue Sky's direct operations. 5 other major airlines had implemented similar protocols after recognizing both the moral imperative and the business case for addressing systemic bias. Transportation Secretary James Wilson, a distinguished white man of 62, had cited the Mitchell Protocol in new federal guidelines for passenger rights protections. Industry analysts had initially predicted financial penalties for Blue Sky following the negative publicity from the Gate D14 incident. Instead, the company's stock had recovered its initial 4% drop and gained an additional 6%, with investor confidence bolstered by improved customer loyalty metrics and reduced liability exposure. This hasn't been an easy process, Marcus acknowledged. We've had to confront uncomfortable truths about our culture. We've discovered patterns of bias that existed beneath our official policies. We've had difficult conversations about how we've failed both our passengers and our own values. He switched to a slide showing passenger satisfaction trends, a sharp upward trajectory that began precisely when the Mitchell Protocol was implemented. What we've learned is that addressing discrimination isn't just morally right, it's good business. When all passengers feel respected and valued, when all employees feel empowered to speak up against injustice, our entire organization functions more effectively. The aviation industry had long operated on the assumption that efficiency and equity were competing values, that taking time to ensure fair treatment necessarily meant sacrificing operational performance. Blue Sky's experience was systematically dismantling that false dichotomy. By eliminating the inconsistent enforcement that characterized our previous approach, we've actually improved boarding efficiency by 23%, Marcus reported, by creating clear guidelines that remove subjective judgment from baggage assessment. We've reduced boarding disputes by 68%. By empowering our staff to address potential discrimination proactively, we've decreased escalation to security by 41%. These statistics told a compelling story addressing bias wasn't just an ethical imperative, but a performance enhancement strategy. The business case for equity was becoming increasingly difficult for even the most profit-focused executives to ignore. Our mystery shopper program has been particularly revealing, Marcus continued. We now send travelers of diverse backgrounds through our system regularly, monitoring how consistently our policies are applied. The data has been invaluable in identifying areas where bias persists despite our best intentions. He shared a slide showing how the Mystery Shopper program had uncovered ongoing disparities in upgrade offers, security referrals, and service recovery responses, all areas now targeted for additional intervention. As Marcus concluded his presentation, he shifted from corporate metrics to human impact. Behind every statistic is a real person, someone's daughter, someone's father, someone's loved one, trying to navigate a system that has historically treated some travelers with suspicion rather than service. The changes we've implemented aren't just about avoiding incidents like what happened to Zoe. They're about creating an environment where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve. Regardless of who they are or who they know, the applause that followed was more than polite acknowledgement of a well-delivered speech. It represented a growing recognition across the industry that the standards had changed, that passengers now expected airlines to address discriminatory practices proactively rather than reactively. That corporate statements about inclusion needed to be backed by measurable actions. As Marcus stepped away from the podium, several industry leaders approached him, not with defensive justifications for their own company's practices, but with genuine questions about implementation, challenges, and lessons learned. The conversation had shifted from whether addressing bias was necessary to how it could be done most effectively. The transformation that had begun with one passenger's humiliation at Gate D14 was expanding beyond a single company, beyond even the aviation industry, to influence how organizations across sectors approached issues of equity. accountability, and human dignity. For Marcus Mitchell, the professional achievement of leading this transformation was inseparable from the personal motivation behind it, ensuring that his daughter's experience became a catalyst for changes that would protect countless travelers who didn't have a CEO father to intervene when they faced similar treatment. Zoe's growth. Zoe Mitchell settled into a seat at the back of Stanford's Meyer Library Auditorium, observing as students filed in for the campus forum on travel rights and passenger advocacy. 3 months earlier, she would have been anxious about public speaking, especially on a topic so personally painful. Now, she felt a surprising calm as she reviewed her notes. Professor Elaine Richardson, who had organized the event, approached with an encouraging smile. "We've got quite a turnout," she said, gesturing to the nearly full auditorium. "Your experience resonated with a lot of students." Zoe nodded, surveying the diverse audience. "I'm just hoping it leads to something constructive." When Professor Richard introduced her, the applause was warm and sustained, a show of solidarity that touched Zoe more deeply than she had anticipated. As she took her place at the podium, she was struck by how much had changed since that afternoon at Gate D14. "3 months ago, I was just trying to get home after finals," she began. "I had the same bags I'd carried on dozens of flights before. I knew the airline policies. I was prepared, polite, and patient. None of that mattered because someone in authority had decided, before I said a single word, that I didn't belong." She paused, making eye contact with students across the auditorium. The silence was complete. Everyone focused intently on her words. "What happened to me that day happens to travelers who look like me every day. The difference is that most don't have a CEO father who can intervene. Most don't have the incident captured on video from multiple angles. Most don't see any consequences for the person who discriminated against them." Zoe had spent the weeks following the incident processing her feelings, first with her family, then with a therapist who specialized in race-based trauma, and finally through journaling that helped her transform raw emotion into articulate analysis. That evolution was evident in her presentation, which moved seamlessly between personal narrative and systemic critique. "I keep thinking about the moments before my father arrived," she continued, "about the passengers who saw what was happening but remained silent, about the security officer who automatically believed the flight attendant's version of events, about the entire system designed to make challenging authority so difficult that most people simply accept the injustice. What could have been a bitter recounting instead became a thoughtful examination of power dynamics, bystander psychology, and institutional structures, reflecting both Zoe's natural analytical abilities and her academic focus on pre-law studies. The most valuable lesson I've learned isn't about airline policies or consumer rights, though those are important," she explained. "It's about documentation as power. Every passenger who recorded what happened created accountability that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Their videos ensured that my experience couldn't be dismissed or minimized." This insight had led Zoe to establish the Travel Justice Initiative, a student organization that educated travelers about their rights and provided resources for documenting and reporting discriminatory treatment. What had begun as a small project with 5 core members had quickly grown to over 70 students across multiple universities, with chapters forming at historically Black colleges and universities nationwide. "We've developed a simple framework called RECORD," Zoe explained, displaying the acronym on the screen behind her. "Recognize discriminatory behavior. Engage calmly but firmly. Capture video evidence. Obtain witness information. Report through official channels. Distribute to advocacy organizations." The initiative had already created practical tools: a smartphone app that guided users through documentation procedures, a Know Your Rights card that could be downloaded and stored on mobile devices, and a database that tracked patterns of discrimination across airlines and airports. "This isn't about punishing individual employees," Zoe emphasized, leaning forward slightly for emphasis. "It's about changing systems that enable discrimination to continue unchallenged. It's about creating consequences that drive institutional change." Her own travel experiences had transformed in the months following the incident. On her most recent flights, she had noticed subtle but significant improvements: more consistent enforcement of policies across all passengers, crew members who seemed more aware of potential bias in their interactions, an overall atmosphere of greater professionalism and respect. The changes at Blue Sky and other airlines that have adopted similar protocols aren't just corporate window dressing, she noted. They're creating measurable improvements in how passengers are treated. But those changes happened because one incident received extraordinary attention. Our goal is to ensure that every traveler has recourse when they face discrimination. This is of who they are or who they know. The question and answer session that followed revealed how deeply Zoe's experience had resonated with her peers. Students shared similar stories of being singled out, questioned, subjected to extra scrutiny in various travel contexts. Each account reinforced the systemic nature of the problem and the need for systematic solutions rather than isolated responses to high-profile incidents. A pre-med student from Nigeria described being repeatedly selected for random additional screening. A Latinx graduate student recounted being questioned about the authenticity of his passport. An Indian-American woman detailed being asked to prove she belonged in the first-class cabin despite having a valid boarding pass. Zoe listened attentively to each story, recognizing patterns that transcended individual experiences. What had happened at Gate D14 wasn't exceptional in its nature, only in its consequences. What keeps me motivated, she told a student who asked about dealing with the emotional toll of advocacy work, is knowing that every documented incident creates the possibility for change. When patterns become visible, they become harder to ignore or dismiss as isolated events. After the forum concluded, several students approached to thank her for speaking so openly about her experience. One young woman, her voice slightly trembling with emotion, said simply, "You turned something painful into something purposeful. That's real courage." The comment stayed with Zoe as she walked back to her dorm across the sun-drenched campus. 3 months earlier, she had been humiliated in front of dozens of strangers, made to feel like an intruder in a space where she had every right to be. Now she was helping others recognize and respond to similar treatment, transforming her individual trauma into collective empowerment. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "How did the forum go?" She typed her response thoughtfully. "Really good. So many students have similar stories. Our initiative is growing faster than we expected. Making a difference feels better than just being angry." His reply came moments later. "Proud of you. You're creating change that will last far beyond one incident or one company." As she continued toward her residence hall, Zoe reflected on how differently things might have unfolded if her father hadn't been at the airport that day, if the confrontation hadn't been recorded, if social media hadn't amplified the story. The injustice likely would have gone unaddressed, as similar incidents did daily across the country. That recognition fueled her determination to ensure that her unexpected platform served a purpose beyond her own vindication, that it created pathways for accountability and transformation that would benefit travelers who didn't have the advantages she'd had in that moment of crisis. The Travel Justice Initiative wasn't just about addressing past wrongs, it was about preventing future ones through education, documentation, and systematic advocacy. It represented Zoe's personal growth from victim to advocate, from someone who had experienced discrimination to someone who was actively working to dismantle the structures that enabled it. As she reached her dorm, another text arrived, this one from her brother Elijah. "Just saw your initiative mentioned in a transportation policy journal. You're officially making waves beyond campus. Keep going." The message brought a smile to her face. What had begun as one painful afternoon at an airport gate had evolved into something with potential for lasting impact. Proof that even the most difficult experiences could become catalysts for meaningful change when approached with purpose and perspective. Karen's redemption journey. The fluorescent lights of Terminal Treasure's gift shop cast a sickly, buzzing glow across the small retail space tucked between gates at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The air here was different from the main terminal, a stale mixture of industrial carpet cleaner, coffee, and passenger fatigue. Behind the counter, Karen Winters arranged a display of Atlanta snow globes with mechanical precision. Her once immaculate uniform was gone, replaced by an ill-fitting blue polo shirt with the shop's logo embroidered on the chest. Her blonde bob, once a helmet of corporate authority, had grown out, dark roots showing through the fading color. 3 months had transformed her life completely. The termination, the viral infamy, the lost pension, the mounting legal fees, all of it cascading from a single confrontation over a green tote bag. The Skywing name that had once opened doors now slammed them shut as potential employers recognized her from the video that wouldn't die. In her darker moments, which came frequently, Karen blamed everyone but herself, the airline, for making her a scapegoat, Marcus Mitchell for abusing his power, Zoe for not simply complying with her instructions. She had been made an example of, her 24 years of service erased by a single incident. But in rare moments of clarity, usually in the quiet hours before sleep, Karen acknowledged truths she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud, that there had been other incidents before this one, that she had applied rules differently depending on who stood before her, that she had wielded her authority as a weapon rather than a responsibility. The shop door chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. A young black woman about 19 or 20 walked in, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something someone had said. She wore a Howard University sweatshirt, her braids gathered in a casual bun atop her head. Karen straightened, customer service mode activating automatically, though without the crisp professionalism that had once defined her. "Welcome to Terminal Treasures," she recited in the flat monotone that had replaced her once authoritative tone. The young woman smiled briefly in acknowledgement before returning to her call, browsing the snack section as she spoke. "No, I've got a 3-hour layover." "Yeah, I know. The conference was amazing, though." Something about her reminded Karen of Zoe Mitchell, not physically, but in her manner, her comfortable confidence, the way she moved through the world assuming she belonged in it, the very thing that had triggered Karen's worst instincts 3 months ago. Karen watched the young woman from behind the counter, noticing the details she once would have used to make snap judgments: the stylish sneakers, the designer backpack, the casually expensive watch on her wrist. 3 months ago, these observations would have fed into Karen's mental calculus of who deserved respect and who deserved scrutiny. Now they were just observations, stripped of their power to trigger her biases by the hard consequences she'd faced. The young woman ended her call and approached the counter with a bottle of water and a granola bar. "Just these, please," she said, smiling politely. As she set them down, a small, glittering keychain fell from her pocket, landing silently on the floor beside the register, unseen by its owner. Karen rang up the items mechanically. $7.85. As the young woman paid, Karen noticed the fallen keychain, a miniature Howard University logo sparkling under the fluorescent lights. A voice in her head, bitter and resentful, whispered, "Let her lose it. She should pay more attention to her things." It was the same voice that had guided so many of her interactions over the years. The voice that categorized people as worthy or unworthy of consideration based on criteria she'd never fully examined. The voice that had led directly to the confrontation at Gate D14 and everything that followed. The young woman collected her items and turned to leave. Karen stared at the keychain on the floor. It represented a choice, the same choice she'd made countless times before, but this time with the weight of everything she'd lost pressing upon her. She could be the person who let the young woman walk away, taking a tiny, secret, bitter victory in someone else's minor misfortune. Or she could be someone else, someone she perhaps should have been all along. "Miss," Karen called, her voice cracking slightly with disuse. The young woman turned back, eyebrows raised in question. Karen bent down, her back protesting after hours of standing, and picked up the small, sparkly trinket. She held it out, palm open. "You dropped this." The young woman's face lit up with genuine relief and gratitude. "Oh my God, thank you so much," she exclaimed, hurrying back to the counter. "My sister just gave me this last week. It's my good luck charm for finals." She took the keychain, her fingers briefly brushing Karen's palm. "Seriously, thank you. You're a lifesaver." The simple, sincere gratitude for such a small act of basic decency hit Karen with unexpected force. This young woman saw her, really saw her, not as an obstacle or an authority figure or a viral villain, but simply as another human being who had done something kind. "You're welcome," Karen replied, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in her mouth. As the young woman left, smiling and reattaching the keychain to her phone case, Karen stood motionless behind the counter. The interaction had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt significant in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Through the shop window, she could see a Blue Sky Airways plane taxiing toward the runway, its logo gleaming in the afternoon sun. She would never again wear that uniform or wield that authority. Her career, her status, her identity as the experienced, respected senior flight attendant, all of it was gone. replaced by the small shop and the humble task of selling overpriced souvenirs to hurried travelers. But in that moment of simple human connection, of choosing kindness over bitterness, assistance over indifference, Karen Winters felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing. Not because of raw roles or authority or fear of the consequences, but simply because it was right. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a return to what had been. But perhaps it was a beginning, not of a return to what had been, but of a different way forward. Outside, the blue sky plane lifted off, climbing steadily into the clear blue Georgia sky, carrying hundreds of passengers who would never know the story of how a confrontation at a gate had transformed not just an airline but the lives of everyone involved. And somewhere in that sky, dignity and respect had become not just corporate values on a website, but living principles guiding thousands of daily interactions. Proof that sometimes meaningful change begins with a single moment of truth, when someone finally decides that enough is enough and that a different way is possible. Full circle moment. The holiday rush at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport had transformed the terminals into rivers of harried travelers, each current flowing toward different gates, different destinations, different reasons for braving the chaos of Christmas season air travel. Terminal D buzzed with particular energy as flights to the West Coast were called. Passengers eager to escape Atlanta's unexpected pre-Christmas cold snap. Zoe Mitchell moved through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated airports her entire life. Stanford's fall semester had ended 2 days earlier, and she was heading home for the holiday break, her navy backpack slung over one shoulder, her burgundy tote, the same one that had sparked the confrontation 3 months earlier, secured in her other hand. She had just purchased a bottle of water from a vending machine when she glanced through the window of a small gift shop and froze. Behind the counter, arranging a display of tourist magnets, stood Karen Winters. The sight was so unexpected that Zoe blinked, certain she must be mistaken. But there was no mistake. The blonde hair had grown out, showing darker roots. The crisp blue sky uniform had been replaced by a blue polo shirt with terminal treasures embroidered on the chest. But the face, that face that had looked at her with such contempt 3 months earlier, was unmistakable. For a moment, Zoe considered simply continuing to her gate. There was no obligation to engage, no reason to revisit a painful experience that she had worked hard to process and move beyond. But something, curiosity, perhaps, or a sense that their shared story remained somehow incomplete, made her hesitate, before she could decide whether to enter the shop or walk away. Karen looked up and their eyes met through the glass. The recognition was immediate and mutual. Karen's hands stilled on the display, her face drained of color. Zoe took a deep breath and entered the shop. The electronic door chime announced her arrival with cheerful obliviousness to the tension suddenly filling the small space. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The ambient noise of the terminal, flight announcements, rolling luggage, conversations, seemed to recede, leaving them in a bubble of awkward silence. "I didn't expect to see you here," Zoe said finally, her voice calm and neutral. Karen's posture had stiffened, her professional mask sliding into place through habit rather than confidence. "I work here now," she replied, the simple statement conveying volumes about how her life had changed since their last encounter. Another silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words, unasked questions, the complex emotions that surrounded their shared history. "I'm sorry," Karen said suddenly, the words emerging with difficulty, as if pushed through a narrow opening, "for how I treated you." The apology hung in the air, simple, unembellished, without excuses or qualifications. Not, "I'm sorry if you felt offended," or "I'm sorry, but I was just doing my job." Just, "I'm sorry." Zoe studied Karen's face, searching for the sincerity behind the words. What she saw was not the entitled authority figure from Gate D14, but someone humbled by consequences. Someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by a single interaction. "Thank you for saying that," Zoe replied carefully. This wasn't a moment for easy forgiveness or performative absolution. The harm had been real. The impact significant. What happened that day wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern of how certain passengers are treated differently based on how they look. Karen nodded slightly, her eyes dropping to the counter between them. "I know that now. I didn't then. Or maybe I didn't want to know." It wasn't a complete acknowledgement, but it represented movement, a shift from the defensive denials she had maintained throughout her termination hearing, a recognition, however partial, of the biases that had driven her behavior. The Mitchell protocol has changed things, Zoe observed. I've flown several times since then. The difference is noticeable: more consistency, more professionalism, less of the selective enforcement I used to experience. Karen's expression tightened slightly at the mention of the protocol that bore Zoe's name, the comprehensive reforms that had been implemented following her termination. I've heard about the changes, she said simply. Zoe adjusted her backpack strap, conscious of time passing, of her flight scheduled to board soon. I should get to my gate. Karen nodded, a mixture of relief and something like regret crossing her face. Their conversation had been brief, awkward, incomplete, but it represented something significant for both women: an acknowledgement, however limited, of their shared history, a small step toward understanding, if not reconciliation. As Zoe turned to leave, Karen spoke again. The protocol, the changes your father implemented, are they really making a difference? The question contained Layer's genuine curiosity, perhaps a desire for meaning to emerge from her professional destruction, a need to know that something positive had resulted from the incident that had cost her so much. Zoe considered her response carefully. Yes, she said finally. For thousands of passengers who previously had no recourse when they were treated unfairly. For employees who now have clear guidelines that remove subjective enforcement. For an industry that needed to acknowledge patterns it had ignored for too long. She paused, then added, "What happened to me that day was wrong. But the response, the systematic changes rather than just individual consequences, that's making air travel more equitable for everyone." Karen absorbed this, her expression unreadable. Then she reached beneath the counter and withdrew a small item, a miniature airplane keychain bearing the Blue Sky logo. She placed it on the counter between them. "A peace offering," she said quietly. "Not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledging that I've learned something important from what happened." Zoe looked at the keychain, a small, symbolic gesture, inadequate to address the full weight of what had transpired between them, yet meaningful in its simplicity. After a moment's consideration, she picked it up. "Growth is possible," she said, meeting Karen's eyes directly. "That's what I tell students when I speak about that day. Systems can change. People can change. That's more important than punishment or revenge." With the keychain in her palm, Zoe nodded a goodbye and exited the shop. As she merged back into the stream of holiday travelers, she reflected on the unexpected encounter. Not a dramatic reconciliation or a tidy resolution, but a human moment between two women whose lives had intersected in a way that had transformed them both. The boarding announcement for her flight echoed through the terminal as she approached Gate D16, just 2 gates down from where the confrontation had occurred 3 months earlier. As she took her place in the premium economy line, she noticed the consistent professional treatment each passenger received, regardless of appearance, regardless of luggage size, regardless of all the factors that had previously determined the quality of service one might expect. The flight attendant, scanning boarding passes, smiled warmly at each traveler. "Happy holidays," she said to Zoe as she processed her boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight home." As Zoe boarded the aircraft, she slipped the Blue Sky keychain into her burgundy tote bag, not as a souvenir of trauma, but as a reminder that systems could change, that accountability could lead to transformation, that the difficult work of addressing bias could create tangible improvements in how people experience the world. It wasn't a perfect ending. Karen Winters would continue working at Terminal Treasures, her career in aviation over. Blue Sky Airways would continue implementing and refining the Mitchell Protocol, recognizing that meaningful change required ongoing commitment rather than a one-time response to a crisis. And Zoe would continue her advocacy work, using her platform to create pathways for travelers without her advantages to seek recourse when they face discrimination. But in that brief, unexpected encounter, in the simple acknowledgement of harm caused and lessons learned, there was something valuable proof that beneath the viral videos and corporate protocols and policy reforms, there were human beings capable of growth, of reflection, of evolution. And perhaps that was the most important transformation of all. 1 year after the incident at Gate D14, the Mitchell standards had become a benchmark for the entire aviation industry. What began as one company's crisis response had evolved into a movement that transformed how airlines approached issues of equity and customers' treatment. The statistics told a compelling story across airlines that had implemented similar protocols. Bias complaints decreased by 67%, customer satisfaction increased by 41%, and employee retention improved by 23%. These weren't just moral victories, but measurable business outcomes that demonstrated the financial value of equitable service. For Zoe Mitchell, the personal growth had been equally significant. The traumatic experience at the boarding gate had become a catalyst for her development as an advocate and leader. The travel justice initiative she founded had expanded to 32 university campuses nationwide, creating a network of educated travelers who understood their rights and had tools to document and report discriminatory treatment. Marcus Mitchell had integrated the lessons from the incident into his broader leadership philosophy, recognizing that true corporate values must be operationalized through systems, accountability, and measurable outcomes. His approach had influenced executive thinking far beyond the aviation industry, demonstrating that addressing bias wasn't just ethically necessary but strategically advantageous. Even Karen Winters had experienced transformation, though of a different kind. Her journey from denial to recognition, from defensive justification to genuine reflection, represented the difficult but essential personal growth that must accompany systemic change. While her airline career had ended, her understanding of her own biases and their impact had only begun to develop. The Mitchell Protocol's most profound impact wasn't in policies or procedures, but in the daily experiences of travelers who would never know how close they had come to facing similar treatment. Passengers whose dignity was now protected by systems designed to ensure consistent, respectful service regardless of appearance, regardless of status, regardless of who they were or weren't related to. Have you witnessed discrimination while traveling? What did you do? Your experience could help identify patterns requiring attention and intervention. Share your story in the comments below with #TravelJustice to contribute to this ongoing conversation. Visit our website for a printable Know Your Rights travel card that outlines federal protections for passengers and provides guidance on documenting discriminatory treatment. This pocket-sized resource has already helped thousands of travelers address unfair treatment effectively. Remember, recording evidence is the first step toward justice. When we document discriminatory treatment, we create the possibility of accountability, not just for individual incidents, but for the systems that allow bias to persist unchallenged. If you found this story impactful, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and transformation. Your support helps us reach more people with these important messages. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our new uploads. Together, we're creating a world where everyone can travel with dignity.